We're here today to talk about love. It's one of those things that's central to human life, that we value very highly, but that is notoriously difficult to define. And it makes love a questionable topic for philosophy these days. Wittgenstein, he once wrote, "Whatever can be said clearly, and that of which we cannot speak, one must remain silent." It's sort of like the summation of the Tractatus. Wittgenstein, in that sentence, sort of offers us the epitome of how it is that the modern mind has come to regard many of our formerly most cherished values, things like love, as impossible to analyze, or things that we can't actually make clear statements about because we can't define them. And therefore, they're not worthy, or they don't merit deep philosophical consideration. I'm not knocking Wittgenstein here. He clearly had a reverence for the mystical side of life, we'll say, in his personal beliefs. And I'm not even trying to make any claims about his broader philosophy. I just like the quotation because I think it sums up how a lot of modern people think about things. You know, we became ever more skeptical of vague and ill-defined or undefinable terms, such as truth or beauty or love. That doesn't mean we stopped appreciating beauty or seeking the truth or loving. But a funny thing, I think, has happened to the modern mind, in that we now feel that we don't have to think about these things anymore. It's the irony of relativism, is that it doesn't open our minds up to infinite possibilities. On the contrary, it makes everything subjective and thus impossible to debate. And so why would philosophy have cause to explore flighty, cloudy ideas such as love? There's no coherent definition to be found. Isn't love, upon closer examination, just a chemical reaction in your brain anyway? Why not leave topics like love for poetry and direct our philosophical concerns towards a more rigorous matters? And so, even if I'm not really trying to talk about any philosophers or any school of philosophers, again, I'd emphasize, I'm just speaking of modern people generally, that we tend to be dismissive of the mysteries of existence, and we tend to be reductive materialist when it comes to things like love. Science has more or less explained everything physiological or biological, and our subjective experiences, in some sense, not, that you're never going to get to any kind of objective fact there. And in terms of the scientific method, one's subjective experience is not proof of anything. And so in the most rigorous terms, your subjective experience can't tell us much about reality, right? And so most of us have the experience of love, but we also have the experience of all sorts of other physiological states, such as hunger or adrenaline or fatigue. And so we can why do we attribute so much special attention to love? Well, there's an answer for that within the sciences too, right? Because we have this human preoccupation with love since time immemorial due to the central importance of the sexual reproduction of the species, the fact that humans typically reproduce in monogamous family units. They exist as these extended kin groups, which makes us social beings, and then that makes us beings who continue our existence through bonds of love, among other things. I mean, there's bonds of duty and obligation, but there's also bonds of love. And so you could say, if you were going to be cynical, well, of course, this makes love seem like the most important thing in the world to human beings, and it makes sense from a scientific standpoint that we should feel that way, but nevertheless, it's just a chemical reaction, really, nothing to see here. I'm not going to quarrel with any of these modern ideas, or I'm not going to mount a counter-argument at this point. I simply think we should start out by recognizing what the modern prejudices are, and because to do that is to be able to stand apart from them by that same act, right? And so this recognition of what may be perhaps our own views on love, whether it's the view I outlined or some other view that you hold, just being aware will allow us to at least try to engage with the text of Plato's Symposium the way that the ancients did. Because to the men discoursing in Plato's Symposium, there is no advanced science of evolutionary biology or human physiology. There's no naturalistic explanations of mankind as simply one species among other species. They did not feel that they had definitive or final explanations for the phenomenon of love. Perhaps they didn't feel they had final explanation for any phenomenon. And so in the world of Plato's Symposium, the world that we're stepping into, the ancient Greek world, there was actually, ironically enough, probably more epistemic humility than we have now, not less. And a lot of this is my opinion, but I think when we knew a whole lot less, and we're aware that we knew a whole lot less, we were less arrogant. I think there's a modern caricature of like the primitive religious psychology, because we tend to think of religious people as people who believe things on faith or without evidence, right? And so wouldn't the primitive form of that be even more ignorant and even more confident without evidence? People didn't come to the possession of their world explanations by means of science in those days, though. And in fact, they had little, if any, conception of the principles that guide modern science, or they didn't understand things like standards of evidence. In general, I'm speaking in general here. And so the world was still a mystery. What few truths their traditions handed down to, the people, they clung to these with dear life all the more strongly because they knew how ignorant they were. And in a world where people lived on the edge of life and death every day, child mortality is very high. People were struck down by diseases they had little understanding of. The patterns of the world's climate and all these things are still very opaque. If we're going to say these people thought they knew anything with any certainty, these people knew that they were playthings of the gods. The pre-modern religious mindset, in my view, represents quite the opposite of arrogance, but rather the acceptance of truths out of tradition because it was all you had. Now, the Greeks did have their religious claims, just as we do, and we'll see plenty of religious references and religious reasoning even within the dialogue of the symposium itself. But the sense that we had more or less explained mankind's place within the physical world and the nature of our origins and the nature of our being, this sense, I would argue, is not there. And the Greek religion could at times be vague and self-contradictory and itself mysterious. I mean, this is why you needed the priests and the oracles and the people who were more in touch with these truths. And the vagueness of the religion is what led to multiple interpretations, ever more sophisticated grasping towards some sort of coherent world picture that the philosophers engaged in. And so in our attempt to inhabit a more ignorant mind state, maybe we can perhaps let go of some of our prejudices regarding what love is and try to approach the question with some epistemic humility. Let's try to allow love to be mysterious once again, something divine and beyond human understanding. That's how the audience, I think, our audience should approach Plato's Symposium. And that's the famous Socratic dialogue on love. It's one of Plato's most celebrated works. It consists of the speeches of several men, all of them prominent people. We have artists, philosophers, statesmen, some of whom are quite famous in antiquity and even have name recognition today, such as the playwright Aristophanes. All of these men gathered together to drink and have a dialogue, and at this dialogue, all of the men compete in giving speeches in honor of Eros. Speeches in the form of a eulogy. Typically, we give a eulogy at a funeral in modern culture. The eulogistic form of praise, in this case, doesn't refer to somebody dead necessarily. It's just a speech of giving praise. Now, said in honor of Eros, right? That's who they're praising. Eros is not an easily translatable term because it's the name for the Greek god of love, but the way the term is used in the text itself includes not just the personage of the god, but also the meaning of love itself. And also, there's other general qualities and connotations that are perhaps not obvious. And so these qualities of love are actually easier to understand through reading the dialogues in the symposium itself, actually. So one of the central questions in the dialogue is the nature of Eros, right? So for me to define it here, it would be kind of giving away the the ending. But all the speakers try to describe Eros in some way or another. And the penultimate speech is given by Socrates, who explains Eros as a universal striving after immortality. After which, Alcibiades shows up and gives a final speech, and in that speech he declares his love for Socrates. And actually, the speech of Alcibiades is unique in that rather than eulogizing Eros, he eulogizes Socrates. And then after these events, all the men drunk fall asleep, except for a few who they stay up all night arguing with Socrates, and so they argue through to the morning. And that's roughly speaking the entire narrative contained in the text. A bunch of guys get together at a party. They talk about love. Everyone falls asleep, except for Socrates, and then they go home. And they're smart, prominent people. They're the leading citizens. So the first question one may ask is whether or not this is a real account of real events, whether the people who are named in the encounter actually said or did the things recorded. The short answer is that it's unlikely. It's unlikely that the events unfolded exactly as Plato described them. And, so we can be pretty sure that it's some poetic or creative license was taken by Plato, we'll say. But, so there's a couple caveats to that. I mean, within the narrative itself, the depiction of the course of events is given to us in the text, openly described as second, or actually really third-hand information. So the story of the symposium is given to us by Apollodorus, who says he was not at the symposium himself, but he heard about it. An unnamed person asks him to recount it as the two are walking from one Greek polis to another. There are some attempts at, Apollodorus tries to date when the symposium must have taken place. I would suggest that given that attempt and the way that it's treated in the story, I think there was likely some kind of real event that this was loosely based on. Maybe there's a story. Maybe it wasn't a real event. Maybe there was a story that it was based on that circulated about a symposium attended by Socrates and Aristophanes and Agathon and Alcibiades and all these famous people. And, if such a thing did happen, we can imagine why that would have been a fabled event, right? It's like a who's who of prominent people in the region. And so perhaps some version of it happened in real life, or perhaps there was just a story that was told or retold. But Plato surely made his share of artistic decisions in crafting the dialogue, because as many people have pointed out, the dialogue is very structured. The order of the speakers, the way that each speech answers the next, what is chosen to be omitted, right? At certain points they say, oh, and then a couple other people spoke, and we don't get to hear their speeches. And so the way that it's arranged and presented has a plan or or an artistic blueprint to it, which suggests this is very, very unlikely that we're getting a faithful representation of events. So perhaps no character's speech bears any relationship to the reality of what the person actually said. Maybe there was some truth to it. On the other hand, maybe on the other side, the other possibility is there was maybe a great deal of truth to what we are reading. There's simply no way of knowing. Whatever the case may be, we only have the text, and so we're simply going to evaluate the text at face value. And it has philosophical significance regardless, I would say, of whether it really happened or not. But I don't know. To me, those questions are interesting of to what degree is this a literary production? To what degree is it an actual account of events, and I think it's probably somewhere in the middle, which is often the case with Plato. But so I've brought up this angle in the story of the veracity of the events involved for another reason, though, because Nietzsche himself wrote in an essay called Mein Lieben, written upon leaving the Academy of Pforta and on his way to Bonn University. He writes, quote, "I remember with the greatest pleasure the first impressions of Sophocles, Aeschylus, Plato, especially in my favorite piece, the Symposium, and then the Greek lyricists," end quote. And so Nietzsche's favorite piece, or his lieblingsdichtung, the Symposium, seems to have captured his imagination because it displayed an array of fascinating characters and thinkers, who each expresses himself in his turn. And so we may remember how also in Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, what seems to fascinate Nietzsche is this procession of people. It's not just a procession of different ideas, but it's a cast of characters with their own distinctive personalities. And he's just as much interested in the images of each man and the life and the character that you're beholding as he is in philosophical content. He sees each dialogue in the Symposium as a sort of articulation of the character and the inner life of each man, of each speaker, as much as they are arguments for the nature of love, right? So revealed within the text are images of extraordinary people, and we'll come back to this idea as we get into Nietzsche's interpretation of Plato's Symposium, which we'll mostly cover in the next episode. But since, it's the Nietzsche podcast, so before we get started, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, at least in rough outline, what Nietzsche saw in the Symposium and why we're talking about it on the podcast in the first place. It was his favorite work during a formative time in his life and thought. And so one of the things he writes about in that essay on Plato's Symposium, that we'll go into greater detail later, he sees the same sort of artistic structure many other interpreters of Plato's Symposium see, or rather, he doesn't see the same story in the same way that many people see a structure. Nietzsche sees one as well. He wrote of how he saw the dialogues building one upon the other to create a fully structured, complex view of Eros. He actually uses the metaphor of a structure, and he says Socrates does not refute the previous speeches, which is a common claim you will hear about the Symposium, but rather he says Socrates continues to build upon the ideas. He rounds it off with a dome, is the way he puts it. And so in the Symposium, he sees this brilliantly structured literary composition, which balanced and, synthesized contradictory aspects of Eros in a sort of dialectic. He does take care to distinguish Plato from Socrates in both of his praise and his criticism. Nietzsche does. But it's worth noting, it's not exactly obvious what level of influence Plato had on Nietzsche. Certainly, this work is of great importance to Nietzsche. We know this from the essay Mein Lieben just as much as from a comparative reading of the text itself with some of Nietzsche's other thoughts. But the question of how influential the ideas of Plato were upon Nietzsche's thought in the grand scheme of things remains a little bit difficult to answer. And the reason for this is that Plato's works and ideas are, like, if we were to take a neutral view of the situation in classical scholarship at the time, Plato is of central importance. He's of great importance to understand still for anyone studying philosophy. We might remember Nietzsche discovered Schopenhauer around the same time when he began reading Plato. And Plato was one of two major Western philosophical influences for Schopenhauer, the other being Kant. And Plato is referenced very frequently in World as Will and Representation, as well as his theory of ideas or of the forms. That's arguably adopted or incorporated by Schopenhauer. And then Nietzsche became a philologist, and he became versed in all things Plato as demanded by that course of education And he, in fact, taught courses about Plato. And remember what Whitehead said, that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote on Plato's work. So, of course, Nietzsche absorbed and understood the ideas of Plato. That much is very clear. There are a few indications, though, that Nietzsche's own philosophy was not that profoundly influenced by Plato. One is his greater degree of neutrality that he displays toward Plato in terms of his tone when he talks about Plato, when contrasted with the way he talks about Socrates, for example. Socrates is somebody Nietzsche has deep, complex feelings about. Nietzsche writes, "Socrates, to confess it frankly, is so close to me that almost always I fight a fight against him." Plato is sometimes critically assessed, sometimes positively assessed, and similar to Socrates in that regard, but there's not the same intensity of Nietzsche's either positive or negative comments that are given on Socrates, the same level of attachment and feeling, the sense that Nietzsche was struggling with Plato or something like that. Oftentimes, Plato is mentioned just alongside numerous classical authors and philosophers, and no special significance is attributed to Plato. So Plato is important, just not particularly important to Nietzsche. Another indication of this is how Nietzsche redefines the pre-Socratic philosophers as pre-Platonics. And so he thus draws a conceptual line separating Plato's teacher, Socrates, from Plato, right? Traditionally, people loop in Socrates and Plato together. Nietzsche divides them. So that's an interesting side effect of designating them pre-Platonics, right? And what Nietzsche says in that essay is that Plato is the first grand mixed character in Greek philosophy, which means he was not a purely original philosophical creation like the other pre-Platonics were, or he wasn't his own man. He wasn't hewn from one stone. He drew on multiple past philosophical ideas and he drew on the ideas of other figures in order to assemble his philosophical structures, whatever you would say. So Plato is not included among these figures, but Socrates is. Some people could have argued Nietzsche was somewhat of a grand mixed character himself, so maybe he kind of identified somewhat with Plato. I think a lot of this gets into speculation, right? But one could even argue that the Symposium, for example, was maybe an example of Plato being a grand mixed type of character, right? This is what Plato does. Plato in the Symposium assembles a host of archetypal views or archetypal ideas, right, in the form of people, and he puts them into some articulated form. What does Plato bring to the table? Well, he arranges it, right? It's his wording, it's his arrangement, it's his artistic touch, it's his writing more beautifully than all the poets. So, I don't know. In any case, we can say that two things are for sure true. Plato is one of the most frequently cited philosophers in Nietzsche's work, so that must be said. Second, really only to Schopenhauer, I believe, in terms of the number of references. And yet, Nietzsche has far stronger feelings towards Socrates, and to Schopenhauer for that matter, when compared to Plato. And in comparison, his attitude towards Plato is far more neutral. Nietzsche acknowledges Plato's importance to the whole of Western philosophy. He thinks Plato made fatal errors. Some of the things he really hates, like democracy, he calls Platonism for the people. So Plato gets his share of fire from Nietzsche. But I think he had stronger feelings for the mentor of Plato rather than Plato himself. Which, if we do identify Nietzsche with a grand mixed type of character like Plato, having stronger feelings towards the mentor of Plato, Socrates, right, as a man who had fatal flaws himself. All this could be an endless psychological goldmine, but alas, most of it is speculation. If you do want to read more about this, I suggest Nietzsche's Wrestling with Plato and Platonism by Thomas Brobier. I believe that's pronounced Brobjer. It's It's very informative. The view there might be a bit controversial, that Plato's philosophical ideas were not very influential on Nietzsche, but Brobier also makes it clear that Nietzsche learned from a professor at Schulpforta who was preoccupied with Plato, and he wrote a letter of recommendation for Nietzsche to another professor who was similarly predominantly concerned with Plato. So whatever his conclusions, Brobier lays out the case very effectively. Plato was just in the background at all times in Nietzsche's academic career. So he's so fundamental to Greek philosophy that it's not evidence in and of itself that Nietzsche knew a lot about Plato and talked a lot about Plato. He's just so fundamental to philosophy. As for Nietzsche's complicated relationship with Socrates, we've talked about that a lot in the episode Nietzsche versus Socrates that we did last season. It's usually the criticisms and the problematizing of Socrates that gets the most attention when people discuss Nietzsche's work. But Nietzsche, especially in his early writing, which would be the time when this was his favorite work and the time when he wrote the essay interpreting Plato's Symposium, Nietzsche in his early writing, he spends a great deal more time admiring Socrates than attacking him. And I would put forward the theory that much of the admiration that he has for Socrates can be specifically sourced to the portrayal of Socrates in this work, the Symposium. And so we're not talking about Socrates as, what would we say, in regard to what he represents philosophically, as to, what he introduced into the philosophical world, so to speak. We're looking at Socrates as a personality, for one, and also as like a trans-historical type, or as an idea, right? And so Nietzsche wrote that Socrates was the first genuine Lebensphilosoph, or philosopher of life. And this is in the pre-Platonic lectures. I'm going to read an excerpt from that lecture on Socrates. Quote, "The means, knowledge, distinguishes him. Knowledge, as the path to virtue, differentiates his philosophical character. Dialectic, as the single path, induction, and definition. The struggle against desire, drives, anger, and so on, directs itself against a deep-lying ignorance. He is the first philosopher of life, Lebensphilosoph, and all schools deriving from him are first of all philosophies of life. A life ruled by thought, thinking serves life, while among all previous philosophers life had served thought and knowledge. Here the proper life appears as a purpose. There, proper knowledge is seen as the highest. Thus, Socratic philosophy is absolutely practical. It is hostile to all knowledge unconnected to ethical implications. It is for everyone and popular because it holds that virtue may be taught. It does not appeal to genius and the highest powers of knowledge. Previously, simple custom and religious subscription sufficed. The philosophy of the seven sages was merely the vitally practical morality so highly esteemed throughout Greece made into formulas. Now the resolution of moral instinct enters. Bright knowledge should be the sole merit, but with bright knowledge humanity has virtue as well. For this is the essentially Socratic belief, that knowledge and morality conjoin." End quote. So the description of Socrates there in that lecture is very different from Nietzsche's criticisms of him that he writes later. And really, if we were to delve into those, that would be beyond the scope of this episode. But to give a short version, Nietzsche's later critique on Socrates involves the accusation that the Socratic examination of all these previously unquestioned values, the Athenian religion and just all the cultural assumptions they made, right? The lies that support their society. That project inevitably turns hostile towards life. And so these kinds of criticisms of Socrates, Nietzsche would begin to mount those criticisms as he began to outline his theory of decadence, his insight that elevating reason and intellect to this kind of supremacy above instinct is a kind of weakening of society. And this prompted, I would call it a reevaluation of Socrates. But here in the passage I just read, Nietzsche emphasizes a different fact. The Socratic project of using knowledge as a means of living virtuously, knowledge as a means of learning how to live best. And so it's in that philosophical spirit that we find the tenor of Socrates' role in Plato's Symposium. And so, in spite of all the scathing criticisms of Socrates he would later make, we find even all the way at the end of Nietzsche's career in Twilight of Idols praise for Socrates. And we find this praise actually in a section attacking Socrates, which is called The Problem of Socrates, which is very fitting for Nietzsche. This is section 8, quote, "He was the first fencing master in the best circles in Athens. He fascinated by appealing to the combative instinct of the Greeks. He introduced a variation into the contests between men and youths." End quote. I think maybe one way of making sense of the praise of Socrates with the condemnation of Socrates is that the Socrates Nietzsche is describing there is the Socrates of the Symposium, and the one that he really criticizes is the Socrates we see in the Apology, right? So Nietzsche here in Problem of Socrates is praising Socrates on the basis of what? His dueling prowess in terms of the battle of wits. And that means Socrates inspired, young men to more or less completely subordinate themselves to him, for one, and become his followers, but also to live lives of philosophy in pursuit of virtue. He had power. He displayed his power. We see multiple followers of Socrates appear in the Symposium, actually. And Alcibiades' final speech is a sort of exaltation of the power of Socrates. So Socrates in the Symposium is not the dreary martyr sacrificing life at the altar of truth that Nietzsche would later condemn. But he's also not, the anti-artistic demagogue that wished to censor art and poetry in the Republic and who never understood music or art, and who was hostile towards the force of Greek tragedy. That's the Socrates, Nietzsche attacks in Birth of Tragedy. In this dialogue, at least, this is where we see him as the Lieben's philosopher, as the inspiration to Nietzsche. And Socrates indeed inspires those around him with the powers of his intellect and appealing to their instinct for competition, using his knowledge to show them how best to live, and so thus offering an inducement to life through the power of philosophy. I'm going to quote from Benjamin Joette's introduction to the Symposium. Quote, "The genius of Greek art seems to triumph over the traditions of Pythagorean, Eleatic, or Megarian systems, and the old quarrel of poetry and philosophy has at least a superficial reconcilement." End quote. I think that Joette's description there, it's one of the best single sentences anyway, that you could give to sort of reconcile all of Nietzsche's problems with Socratism and Platonism with his love of this particular text. Ever yearning for an artistic Socrates, for a force of reason that exalts the irrational and mingles with poetry and music, right? Here Nietzsche finds it. And this is his lieblingsdichtung. Before we jump into the text, I know I've been giving quite a bit of intro, but I think it's all very important. I just want to clarify the historical point of just what the Symposium is as a social institution in ancient Greece. I'm going to draw on a source I used actually in the episode about Nietzsche and Socrates, but so if you listen to that, this is a refresher. It's from N.T. Crowley's Euripidean Polemic, The Trojan Women and the Function of Tragedy, Cambridge University Press. Quote, authors as distant from each other as Theognis and Plato agree in seeing the symposium as a model for the city, a gathering where men may examine themselves in a playful but nonetheless important way. Here we should note the repeated use of the word, and it's a Greek word, but it means touchstone or test, to describe the symposium. Moreover, at the symposium, poetry plays a significant part in teaching the participants the characteristics required of them to be good men. End quote. So, put simply, a symposium, it's a gathering of men. Usually they are discoursing on a given subject. It's a sort of social test. Wine is involved because, as is said in the text, alcohol loosens inhibitions, but there's also an element of competition involved there too, in terms of how much wine you can drink. This is also referenced in the text. And we must also consider that due to the very normal homosexual relationships, which were very common in ancient Greece, there could be a sexual element involved in the competition as well. One could be trying to impress someone that they would like to, take as a lover. Or, they might be planning on making in advance as the night goes on. And so this is all to say, even though this is a social institution that was exclusively male, it doesn't mean that the relationships between the people at the symposium were strictly Platonic, no pun intended. And in fact, we'll see from the events of the symposium that, that's not the case in this symposium. So the symposium was a social testing ground where men displayed their virtue and their wits. That should not escape us, in light of the fact that Socrates was the finest fencing master in all Athens, in the words of Nietzsche. So next, before we move further, let's look at all the attendees and just go over them so that you're familiar with all these people. I know it's a lot of Greek names, so you may forget who's who, but we'll just go over them. So aside from Socrates, who is there? We have the host of the party. There's Agathon. Agathon is a playwright who is celebrating the triumph of his first tragedy being performed. And he's celebrating it with a party, with the symposium. And so he's invited several of these prominent men. Proceeding in the order in which the men speak, there's Phaedrus. He's a member of the Socratic circle of philosophers. He appears in several dialogues. And he has an interest in, rhetoric and sophism. And then there is Pausianus, an expert in matters of law. So I'm guessing he would just be, like, in modern terms, a legal scholar or a lawyer. Then there's Eryximachus, a physician, doctor. Then there's Aristophanes, the famous playwright. He wrote The Birds and the Frogs, and Aristophanes is where we get the saying Cloud Cuckoo Land. That's from one of his plays. Finally, we have the host, Agathon. He speaks, and then Socrates. And then finally, Alcibiades, who is a general and a statesman. And he crashes the party and drunkenly exclaims his love for Socrates. All these men, as we've said, were prominent among Greeks, but particularly so are Aristophanes, Socrates, and Alcibiades, who are all famous independent of anything in this document, right? If the symposium didn't exist, we would still know who all three of those men are, and they would all be famous. The impetus for the speeches about Eros is the fact that the symposium that they're holding is not to include a drinking competition, so they use these speeches to be the competition instead. Most of the men in attendance, they agree at the beginning, they have all been hitting the wine a little too hard recently. So then, rather than trying to compete with one another for who can drink the most, they all just decide, we'll just drink as much as we want. And then Eryximachus makes the following proposal, which I will quote in an abridged manner. Quote, "On several occasions, Phaedrus has said to me in annoyance, Isn't it awful, Eryximachus, that hymns and paeans have been made by the poets for other gods, but for Eros, who is so great and important a god, not one of the many poets there have been has ever made a eulogy. To this day, not one human being has dared to hymn Eros in a worthy manner. But so great a god lies in neglect. Now, Phaedrus, in my opinion, speaks well in this regard, so as I desire to make a comradely loan to please him. It is, in my opinion, appropriate for those of us who are now here to adorn the god. Each of us, starting on the left, should recite the fairest praise of Eros that he can, and Phaedrus should be the first to begin, inasmuch as he is lying on the head couch and is also the father of the argument." End quote. Everyone agrees to this proposal, which means that Phaedrus will speak first, and Phaedrus begins by declaring that Eros is among the oldest and most important of all deities, since it is written by Hesiod that in the order of creation, chaos came into being first, and then earth, and then after this, Eros. Phaedrus then invokes that other learned people have agreed with Hesiod, and that all the ancient sources seem to suggest that Eros was there near the beginning of all creation. Quote, "As he is the oldest, we have him as the cause of the greatest goods, and I can hardly point to a greater good from youth onward than to have a good lover, and for the lover, a beloved." End quote. And a note on this. So I am actually using multiple translations for different parts of the text. So sometimes you may hear Eros referred to as Eros and sometimes as love. And then you will also hear this talk of lovers and beloveds. There's this idea that the lover is the person who pursues, and the beloved is the person who, is pursued, rather, right? And this applies, it seems to especially obtain in the homosexual sexual relationships. But we might also consider it in terms of, what are the traditionalist gender roles of who pursues and who is pursued in the West? It would be that men traditionally are supposed to pursue and the woman is to be pursued, right? And that, so this is what they're talking about with lovers and beloveds. But in theory, anyone could be a lover and anyone else could be a beloved for our purposes. But, the text takes care to distinguish this. The reasoning that Phaedrus gives as for why having a lover is the greatest good, he goes on in his speech to talk about how it's the honor and the shame that having a lover inspires. And Phaedrus says that among all our peers in social relations, there's no one that it's worse to be ashamed of, or to be ashamed in front of, than one's lover, right? Or I guess the way I misspoke initially holds true, right? There's nothing worse than being ashamed of the one you love, right? So the theory here is that a genuine bond of love between significant others, for example, that improves the person by driving them to be honorable or virtuous in the eyes of the one they love and avoid being shameful or behaving shamefully in front of them. And so Phaedrus goes so far as to say that if a city's defenders are all lovers, they will fight harder and more honorably to appear honorable and beautiful in the eyes of their loves. And so Phaedrus makes his case here, quote, "A real man in love would, of course, far less prefer to be seen by his beloved than by all the rest when it comes to deserting his post or throwing away his weapons. He would choose to be dead many times over before that happened, and to say nothing of leaving behind one's beloved or not coming to his aid when he is in danger. There is no one so bad that, once the god Eros had entered him, he would not be directed towards virtue, to the point where he is like one who is best by nature. And simply, as Homer said, the strength that the god breathed into some of the heroes, Eros supplies from himself to lovers." End quote. What I find interesting in this passage of Phaedrus's first speech, it's the view of virtuousness that love that love brings out, right? Virtue, remember, has the moral sense of the term. We might also consider the word virtue in the sense of a quality or trait that something has, such as in the sentence, by virtue of the fact that the earth is tilted on its axis, we have seasons, right? And so that's the term virtue as saying because of an aspect or quality. But we should, really it means a strength, right? In the same way we talk about like the healing virtue of an herb. It's a positive, it tends to be a positive quality. So a virtue is an aspect of someone's character. It's not a moral commandment. And so here we have the perfect example that Phaedrus sees virtue in a lover giving his life to protect the one he loves. And so we might say this is not necessarily a moral act. Good people as well as bad people could be expected to protect their families or the ones they love. People such as their spouse or their children, even up to the point of giving their own life. As Nietzsche says, whatever is done out of love occurs necessarily beyond good and evil. And so it's this conception of virtue given by Phaedrus, it doesn't partake of that good and evil ideology of, morally determined categories of action chosen by a rational, deliberating intellect. Virtue is something that comes from within. In fact, it actually doesn't. It comes from a god in this case. But it comes from something that's not the rational ego. It's the important thing. So our instincts, passions, or drives in the Greek conception, rather than being reduced to some physiological explanation, are seen as the commandments of a god, or the inspiration or the influence of a god. That's what compels us when we are stricken by a passion, right? And so those drives that we possess that can be regarded as strengths are our virtues. And as Homer says, the strength that the god breathes into us. And so Phaedrus seems to suggest no matter how bad of a person you are, and here he means bad in the Greek sense, right? Bad as in cowardly or weak. If the god breathes strength into you, even you will lay down your life in the name of honor. And that's the power of love that Phaedrus thinks has been with existence for all time. And then he lists off a bunch of figures from the Greek mythos who threw away their lives or did great things for love, like Alcestis, who gave her life for her husband, Orpheus, who went down to hell to find his wife, even though he brings up, even though he was failed and he was mocked by the gods for his cowardice, he still, he tried. And then Achilles, who avenged his lover, Patroclus. And so Phaedrus concludes his speech with the sentiment that it's not the object of one's love, but rather the lover themselves who is close to the divine, or closer to the divine, because whoever loves has the God within him. You're a vessel for Eros. You're close to the divine when you're in love. And so in Phaedrus' speech, what we have is essentially an explanation of love as this divine force that compels us to virtue that's always been here. And virtue in the Greek sense that we've just spoken of. So on that account, love is a wonderful thing because it strengthens us in that regard. And this is true regardless of whether our love is even returned or not. And it's like the seizure of ourselves, the seizure of the spirit by the power of love. That's divine in and of itself. And so that's mostly, that's the gist of Phaedrus' speech. That is his way of praising love. Apollodorus, who's the narrator, he tells us that some other people spoke, presumably other guests. They said a bunch of things that are not memorable enough to write down. And then the time came eventually for Pausianus to speak. Pausianus is the legal expert, the next significant figure in the dialogue. His first act is to make a distinction and to insist that Eros is not of a single character. Pausianus argues, quote, Phaedrus, in my opinion, it is not noble the way the argument has been proposed to us, commanding us to eulogize Eros in so unqualified a fashion. For were Eros one, it would be noble, But as it is not noble, for he is not one. And as he is not one, it is more correct that it be declared beforehand which Eros is to be praised." End quote. So we began accepting the prompt for what it was, right? We're all going to eulogize Eros. We're all going to give speeches in praise of love, with Phaedrus giving his praise by arguing that love is a force that betters mankind, by compelling us to virtue. Here, Pausanias questions the premise by suggesting the term we're using for the phenomenon, which is Eros or love, is not a single thing. We have to make a distinction between two things that are being conflated under this label. Pausanias invokes a mythological justification for his argument. There are, in the Greek mythos, two Aphrodites. There is no Aphrodite without Eros, sort of the second premise of the syllogism, because they're both gods of love, and thus, you cannot have two Aphrodites without two erote, which is the plural of Eros. So there must be two erote, not simply one deity that embodies the force of love, but two to match the two Aphrodites. Now, historically, the reason why there are two Aphrodites has to do with the exchange of religions and cultures. The regional deities, which sprung up as gods of individual cities or peoples, became known around, wider and wider areas, as empires were founded and international trade happened. And then the influence of different religious cults intermingled, and then the way that the human mind, will say, dealt with the contradictions that this sometimes raised, such as when two different peoples have two different goddesses of love with similar attributes, but different names. And that's quite common because people tend to produce a predictable selection of gods whenever pantheism is the rule. But the way the human mind deals with this is by syncretism. And what this means is that the two deities become merged into the same entity. There's a retcon, and put it into modern decadent terms for you. Both are simply two faces or two aspects of one being. But, and this happened all the time. The Romans borrowed from the Greeks, and they borrowed from the Etruscans. Greeks, states borrowed from one another, from Eastern cultures, from the Persians, and so on and so forth. It's very common, for people to just say, well, Ares? No, that's just our war god Mars, But in any case, so then what we have in Greek religion at that time is this conception that there's Aphrodite Urania and Aphrodite Pandemia. These are two commonly known aspects of the goddess Aphrodite. In Xenophon's symposium, Xenophon wonders whether there are actually two goddesses or whether it's simply two aspects of one goddess, which, in consideration of everything I just talked about, I guess you could say both are true. But here in Plato's Symposium, he portrays them as if they're different entities, insofar as one Aphrodite is created by the god Uranus and has no elder, was not actually born. And then the other Aphrodite is born of Zeus and Dione. The Aphrodite that was the daughter of Uranus was Aphrodite Urania, and she came to represent the heavenly, otherworldly form of the goddess of love, representing a love that is spiritual rather than physical or lustful. If you've seen the famous painting of Aphrodite emerging from the sea foam, that's Aphrodite Urania. Now she's contrasted here with Aphrodite Pandemia, daughter of Zeus and Dione, who is said to represent the common form of love. And so she represents physical love and lust. So Urania is heavenly spiritual love. Pandemia is common physical love. The etymology for pandemia should be clear too, especially since we've all just lived through a pandemic, right? It's everywhere, common. And so this is a type of drive, if we want to keep going with the idea that the gods are describing drives that are powerful within the psyche, this is a type of drive that inhabits everyone in the sense that physical lust can exist in all human beings, and it does, right? It's just a biological fact. And so this is perhaps reducible in our modern thinking to a biological drive, which we mentioned at the beginning of the episode. But it's the important thing is that the distinction he's drawing here is to point out that there is a type of love that everyone experiences, and then there is a more select type, right? What Passianus wishes to distinguish, that if it's true, as Phaedrus says, that loving is a divine thing, right? And insofar as one is a lover, they're in some sense sacred because they're inhabited by a god. Passianus is saying that being inhabited by Eros pandemia, right? The common physical type of Eros, which often manifests simply as lust, that's nothing special. It's not a divine thing because this God's with everyone. This type of love, the lower common base type of love, what we might call our baser instincts, that's not in itself anything incredible. It includes, in this type of love, it includes love of men, but it also as well as love of women, love of the body, love of the body rather than the soul, you might say, or in modern terms, instead of the psyche. So then Passianus draws attention, by contrast, to the Uranian type of Eros, which is a spiritual type of love. And this is the type of love that fosters man's eternal improvement, that coaxes out mankind's virtue, as Phaedrus was talking about. Passianus argues, quote, "It is the pandemian lover who is no good, the one in love with the body, rather than with the soul. He is not even, for example, a lasting lover, because he is in love with a thing that is not lasting either. As soon as the bloom of the body fades, which is what he was in love with, he is off and takes wing, having made a foul shame of many speeches and promises. But he who is in love with good character remains throughout life, for he is welded to what is lasting. So our law in good and noble fashion really wants to test these and to have the beloved gratify one group of lovers and escape from the others. On account of this, it exhorts lovers to pursue and beloveds to flee, setting up a contest so that there may be a test as to which group the lover belongs and which group the beloved." End quote. So he invokes law here. The impression I get from reading a couple different translations of law in the context Passianus, the legal expert, uses it, is that it does refer to what we would call laws in modern times, but it also refers to what today we might call conventions or moral norms, social mores. Some of these indeed may have been backed by force, but it seems that this is something that was more enforced on the social level rather than the strictly use of state force, whatever, as we would think of it today, with the bureaucracy of litigation and so on. Anyway, Passianus sees the moral conventions of the community as created in accord with the dictates of the higher love, the Uranian love, and that by encouraging lovers not to be promiscuous, it encourages a contest wherein lovers vie for affections by bettering themselves and committing themselves to all sorts of promises and deeds. And he takes care to stress, as a lawyer might, that the way an action is carried out has an effect on how we should regard that action. The intentions and the skillfulness with which someone loves should be considered in determining what type of lover they are. And this is necessary for us to perceive, because people who love superficially and who are just lustful, right, will abandon you when your body grows old or when you get ugly. Promiscuity and shallowness is not something that improves the community or cultivates virtue. So love done in a promiscuous way is a vice and is shameful, Love done in the Uranian sense, love of one's character, is a virtue and honorable. And I think there's definitely, just to say it, a double entendre with saying, they're not a lasting lover if they love the body. It's an interesting sort of almost oxymoronic statement, right? Or an oxymoronic pun that he's doing there. Because he's saying the lover of the body, like the lasting lover thing seems to me to be like, he doesn't last in bed, right? There's a double entendre there, but he's saying they're not a lasting lover because they love the body. So you have to love the soul. That's how you become a truly lasting lover. Another central element to this dichotomy put forward by Pausanias is that the Pandemian love involves heterosexual relationships as well as homosexual. But Uranian love, in his view, is expressed only between men and really is only perfected in the convergence between these virtues that are enforced by the community morality, restraint and patience when it comes to relationships and practice of virtue. And the pursuer in a sexual relationship should be tested. The object of his affection shouldn't be too easy to yield. And he even extends his definition of superficial types of love to the love of power and the love of wealth. All of these things are just as fleeting as the human body, right? Or as the human body's attractiveness and its youth and health are. So the true lover is somebody with a noble mind who possesses virtue and who pursues other nobly minded people. That's Uranian love, which is a better, higher type of love. Pausanias is saying, bring me a higher love. I wonder how many song lyrics I can quote. I've already done Power of Love and Bring Me a Higher Love. Next, Aristophanes is about to speak, but he starts momentarily sputtering with hiccups from the wine. So he passes his turn to Eryximachus, the physician, and who was the man who put the challenge to the group in the first place to make speeches about love, about Eros. So then Eryximachus takes the conversation in an interesting direction. First thing he does is he expands our focus. He expands the question. He says that, quote, "Inasmuch as Eros is double, it is a fine thing to divide him, but that he proceeds not only over the souls of human beings in regard to the beautiful, but also in regard to many other things, and in other cases, the bodies of all the animals, as well as those things that grow in the earth, and just about all the things that are. That, in my opinion, I have come to see from medicine, our art. How great and wondrous the God is in his comprehensive aims, both in terms of human things and in terms of divine things." End quote. So Eryximachus goes on to describe how these two erote, this dual eros, appears across the whole of nature. It's not a phenomenon that Eryximachus thinks should remain limited to human beings in their romantic relationships. So remember, this is a competition to see who can best praise Eros, right? So the first two speeches assumes we should praise Eros based on Eros's, bringing out of virtue within humans. Eryximachus then expands this way out. This is his way of praising Eros in a fuller way. He takes the definition that had been established of Eros, the Uranian Eros, as something that cultivates and induces virtue, which is to say, another way you could look at it is cultivates strength and health, right? The way we've been talking about virtue in the Greek sense. Eryximachus then interprets Eros here as a means of describing the health or sickness of an entire system, like a physiological system or a biological system, and that it applies to nature, it applies to animals, things that grow in the ground, so to plants as well. So no longer thinking of Eros as a human phenomenon, and no longer thinking of the human being as this essentialized thing, Eryximachus takes the conversation into the realm of physiology, that's his experiences in medicine. The body must be approached as a whole system. And so I've abridged this, but here is what Eryximachus says on this matter. Quote, "The nature of bodies has this double eros, for the health and the sickness of the body are by agreement different and dissimilar. The art of medicine is, to sum it up, the expert knowledge of the erotics of the body, in regard to repletion and evacuation, and he who diagnostically discriminates in these things between the noble and base love is the one most skilled in medicine, while he who induces changes so as to bring about the acquisition of one kind of love in place of another, and who, in whatever things where there is no love, but there needs must be, has the expert knowledge to instill it, or to remove it from these things in which it is but should not be, would be a good craftsman. For he must, in point of fact, be able to make the things that are most at enmity in the body into friends, and to make them love one another. The most opposite things are the most at enmity, cold and hot, bitter and sweet, dry and moist, and anything of the sort. Our ancestor, Asclepios, who had the expert knowledge to instill love and unanimity into these things, as the poets here assert, and I am convinced is so, put together our art. End quote. So, he's using the term art and craft roughly interchangeably there. So he's saying medicine is the erotics of the body, right? He redefines the dichotomy as it was previously laid out. The way it was previously laid out was these two beings. So they're essentialized categories, right? There's Uranian Eros versus Pandemian Eros. The way Eryximachus is talking here, it really reminds me of yin-yang thought in Chinese philosophy. Here, the Uranian stands for that which nourishes. That's the basis on which Eryximachus speaks of medicine as the art of erotics, of providing love for example, one of the body's humors, which is to say, providing nourishment for one of the humors, right? We could say, doing things that will, the humors in the old view of human physiology. This is all obviously well outdated, but the idea of these fluids and forces within your body, you can do certain things to nourish them, and you got to keep these forces in balance, right? So the Uranian is that which nourishes. Meanwhile, the Pandemian stands for that which is sick or declining. In the broader sense, Eryximachus is just pointing out the total system may require a unanimity, as he calls it. He cites that as the founding insight of medicine, springing from Asclepios, managing a balance between dry and moist, hot and cold, and so on. All these opposites within the body that could be said to be either nourishing or depleting, depending on the context, right? And the balance he wants is this total harmony of the system. So we can no longer understand the Uranian, the nourishing power of love, separate from this understanding of the total harmony at which it aims, right? Which involves incorporating the Pandemian in the proper balance. It's all very Chinese in terms of the philosophical approach. As we discussed when I talked with Hans-Georg Müller, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus can be compared to some Chinese philosophers, and he too is referenced in Eryximachus' speech here because Heraclitus wrote of a unity between opposites, and that's who he invokes. And so we may simply note here that the Greek understanding of medicine, the body, as governed by fluids and humors, being in or out of balance or whatever, that's outdated. But so long as we understand how they thought about medicine, we can understand the broader point that Eryximachus is making. So really, he's taking Pausianus's claims through to their logical conclusion that whether we judge an action as base or shameful, or as virtuous and honorable, it's not contained within the action itself, but based on the context. As Pausianus said, on our intentions, on the results, on our skillfulness in doing so. It's the way that one loves that determines whether the result is of the Uranian Eros or of the Pandemian Eros. So one may even nourish some aspect of the body which is Pandemian in nature, but if the overall goal is the harmony and flourishing of the organism, that's what really counts. And so Eryximachus then compares this, he compares it to other crafts, right? He extends the discussion to the art of musical composition, to the shaping of both rhythm and melody. It's another parallel to the Chinese philosophers, frankly. Eryximachus even attributes the turning of the seasons to alternating cycles of these two erote. It's their balance or imbalance that produces hot or cold, dry and moist. And when that lack of balance is particularly intense, that's where we get things like natural disasters or plagues or the like, or in the case of the human body, disease. So even in matters of religion, in terms of man's ritual sacrifices and the art of divination, Eryximachus believes the goal is to honor this healthy equilibrium of the whole that Eros creates, that through communion between God and man, maintaining a healthy relationship between the two. All these sacrifices and rituals are ultimately, they're accomplished through the healing power of Eros, in Eryximachus' view. The powerful philosophical ideas underneath this proclamation It's through what he's saying is that it's the skillful maintenance of this balance, moderation, that creates virtue. And Eros is the force that cultivates this virtue, not just in human life, but in all things, all domains, all aspects of existence. And so Eryximachus concludes his speech this way, quote, "This is the great and overwhelming power that Eros as a whole has, and indeed it is rather close to total power. But Eros, concerned with good things, consummately perfected with moderation and justice, among us and among gods, this has the greatest power and provides us with every kind of happiness, making us able to associate with one another and to be friends, even with the gods who are stronger than we are." End quote. It's interesting that we see there the Greek morality come out again, right? That how amazing to be friends with somebody who's stronger than you are. Inconceivable. But some of the, this is I think Eryximachus is very impressive, and maybe he thought he would end the dialogue with by that slam dunk of a speech, right? But some of the heaviest hitters in the symposium are still to come. Then after him, we have the famous playwright, Aristophanes. At this point, Aristophanes is newly recovered from his hiccuping, and he begins by suggesting that he wishes to take the dialogue in a slightly different direction. Nevertheless, he offers a couple preliminary remarks that seem to recapitulate to the previous speakers, the previous arguments for Eros, namely when he says, quote, "Eros is the most philanthropic of gods, a helper of human beings, as well as a physician dealing with an illness, the healing of which would result in the greatest happiness for the human race." End quote. So he does directly reference the previous arguments, and he sort of pays his tribute to them, so to speak. He's still speaking of Eros as this universal force giving rise to that which is virtuous, cultivating unique strengths, we might say, of not just mankind, but all the world. But Aristophanes kind of starts out, he starts out by chastening the previous speakers that mankind does not truly know the nature of Eros because man lives in ignorance of the divine. And he says that if we really understood all that we owe to the healing power of Eros, we'd have constructed the greatest shrines and temples and be making the greatest sacrifices to him. And yet, as the participants noted at the start of this symposium, hardly any poet can even be found to compose a paean for poor Eros. If he's the greatest of all the gods and responsible for all of our virtue and betterment, why is Eros such an unknown god in the first place? Well, Aristophanes says, to explain this, quote, "You must understand human nature and its afflictions," end quote. And so as for what this affliction is over mankind, which makes us so ignorant of the true nature of the divine Eros, Aristophanes proceeds to give a mythological account for the origins of love in mankind. It's one of the most famous, or perhaps infamous, speeches in the symposium, and there are some who have considered Aristophanes' speech rife with absurdity, as it is to be intentionally comedic in nature. And many wonder whether Aristophanes is recounting a myth that was actually believed in, or whether he himself, even believes the things that he's saying here, or whether it's just a story. After all, the man is a playwright, so I'll leave you to decide that for yourselves. Aristophanes tells us that originally, human beings had three genders. There were males, females, and a hermaphroditic third gender, the name of which he says has been lost, sadly. Human beings in their original form had two faces, twice the amount of limbs they have now, twice the number of genitals. That's how you have the third gender, right? And so they were so strong and powerful that they threatened to attack the heavens, leading to a debate amongst the gods as to how to deal with them. Many of them wished to destroy the humans, but others worried over losing the sacrifices that the humans made to the gods. Finally, Zeus commanded that mankind be rent asunder, torn in two, right? And then he sends Apollo to go and reshape human beings. After Zeus cleaves them all in two, right? And he sends Apollo to go shape them into a new form with only a single face and only 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 set of genitals, and so on and so forth. And that's the form we're in now. This form of human beings is weaker and was therefore no match for the might of the gods. The result is that the human beings now give twice as many sacrifices to the gods, right? So the gods get to have their cake and eat it too. Zeus, it's Zeus's solution. I'll read here from Aristophanes' speech. Quote, "After the division, the 2 parts of man, each desiring his other half, came together, and throwing their arms about one another, entwined in mutual embraces, longing to grow into one. They were on the point of dying from hunger and self-neglect, because they did not like to do anything apart. And when one of the halves died, and the other survived, the survivor sought another mate, man or woman, as we call them, being the sections of entire men or women, and clung to that. They continued to perish, so Zeus, in pity of them, invented a new plan. He turned their genitals round to the front, for this had not been always their position, for they had previously reproduced in the earth, like cicadas, but now could reproduce within one another. And after the transposition, the male generated in the female, in order that by the mutual embraces of man and woman they might breed, and the race might continue. Or if man came to man, they might be satisfied and rest, and go their ways to the business of life. So ancient is the desire of one another, which is implanted in us, reuniting our original nature, making one of 2, and healing the state of man. Each of us, when separated, having one side only, like a sliced fillet of soul, is but the indenture of a man, and thus he is always looking for his other half." End quote. It's fascinating to me about this story and the speech of Aristophanes. It seems to me as if he takes us a few steps backward, right, out of the ever-expanding scope of the discussion. The discussion's expanding so that Eros is becoming this divine force over all things. And then Aristophanes takes us back to the discussion of romantic love between human beings, and tells us a story that more or less only explains, it's like an origin myth for romantic love between humans. You can see from just the text of the speech itself, it doesn't actually account for all the things that Eryximachus was talking about in just the speech before him. But his pretext for giving this part of the speech is that it's to explain why we're not as strong and smart and powerful as we used to be, and that's why we no longer know the ways of Eros. But the story itself, it's mythical, it's fantastical, it's absurd, as we said, and it seemingly excludes Eros from the discussion for the most part, right? If you look at the actual characters and motivations, the real origins of love is something created out of the machinations of Zeus and the gods and their war with mankind. Love, as mankind experiences it in this fable, is a result of being split in 2 by means of Zeus. And it's this pursuant then feeling of, or this consequent feeling of yearning we have to be made whole again, to become our full selves again. But there's a clever way in which this story is sort of a response to Eryximachus. And, the Eryximachus' framework that the power of Eros is found in the unanimity between apparent opposites, the synthesis of things which are apparently at odds. Aristophanes presents a story in which people are literal other halves, where the seeking of this sense of wholeness outlined in the abstract in Eryximachus' speech takes on an aspect that's so literal that it becomes absurd. But I would argue that Aristophanes, he's taken consideration of the symposium so far, which has, concluded in the idea that Eros cultivates virtue by bringing out wholeness, and he represents what's been said in a literalized narrative, we could say. The narrative takes into account things like the sexual impulse. That's what we might call the Pandemian aspect of the narrative, which is explained by the absurd literal details of Zeus arranging human beings' genitals, and making the seeking of wholeness expressed in the sexual impulse and coming together in a physical sense. But Aristophanes counterbalances that Pandemian part of the representation he's giving us Further in his speech, he argues, quote, "No one would be of the opinion that it was sexual intercourse that was wanted, as though it were for this reason, of all things, that each so enjoys being with the other in great earnestness. But the soul of each plainly wants something else. What it is incapable of saying, but it divines what it wants and speaks in riddles. If Hephaestus with his tools were to stand over them as they lay in the same place, and were to ask, 'What is it that you want, human beings, to get for yourselves and from one another?' And if in their perplexity he were to ask again, 'Is it this you desire, to be with one another in the same place as much as possible, and not to leave one another night and day? For if you desire that, I am willing to fuse you, and make you grow together into the same thing, so that, though two, you would be one. And as long as you lived, you would both live together, just as though you were one. And when you died, there again in Hades, you would be dead together as one instead of two. We know that there would not be even one who, if he heard this, would refuse." End quote. And so, as absurd as Aristophanes' conceit is, even here, in this literal example of being fused by a blacksmith into a single body, but what he's hitting at is the idea of being together, even in death, even beyond death. That is, I think, almost indisputably what lovers want. And this togetherness cannot be reduced to the desire for sex or for lust or for physicality. And in this way, Aristophanes even manages to reach the same transcendent place of discussion that the dialogue has been aiming at so far, in that he ultimately shows love to be something which goes beyond physical attraction, beyond the body, beyond sexual reproduction, even beyond death. A desire for wholeness, for togetherness with one's other half, is far above anything like physical lust. It's aiming for that sense of unanimity, of wholeness, of that equilibrium. So we have in these first four speeches this progression, which I will recap for you. Phaedrus is the one who sparks off the discourse. The speech he gives is more or less in line with the standard formula of a eulogy. It's also another name for this type of speech is an encomium. The type of speech they would give, it includes the origin of the subject, the noble genealogy of the deity, who's being praised, as well as a list of the good qualities or virtues, his habits and way of life, and finally, the achievements. That type of speech was premised on the idea of reciprocity, on the idea that the ancient Greek would gain the favor of the god by eulogizing them. And so that's roughly the structure of Phaedrus' speech. But in giving it, he outlines the scope of the discussion, and that he ends up asserting, intentionally or not, that the definitive feature of love understood here as a force, as a divine being within mankind, is that lovers and their beloveds will die for one another. That's how he praises the power of Eros. But here the idea is only vaguely outlined because Phaedrus is treating Eros as a god, as a force of the passions affecting or motivating human beings. And his idea of it is undifferentiated, for example, offering no distinction between the force that motivates physical lust and the force that forges these deep, emotional, spiritual bonds. Pausanias' speech accounts for that distinction by establishing the higher and lower Eros, while still remaining on the level of analysis where Eros is a force that only manifests in human beings and only in terms of human social life. But he establishes that there's the type that's common and physical, and another which is spiritual, and that he associates with the type of relationship one may have with a wise mentor from whom they learn. Not simply romantic sexual love, but a love based on enrichment of the soul. Eryximachus' speech takes this principle and applies it to all of nature, the entire physical world. So we might say that the force of Eros, as we've been examining it, manifests in these two aspects, a higher and a lower aspect in human life, but that Eros itself is a much broader force that governs things beyond the human. Eryximachus also talks about good and bad types of love, continuing the distinction set up by Pausanias. But because love is no longer simply an attraction between human beings, but something that acts in the whole world, the understanding of Eros gives way to an understanding of the external world and the skills that help us master the external world. So accordingly, while Pausianus may say that the romantic partner should gratify moderate lovers, but not narcissistic, self-indulgent lovers, Eryximachus says that the expert, such as the doctor or the priest or the musician or the craftsman, must gratify moderate desires and not become victim to a self-indulgent desire, just as, Pausianus advises us not to become victim to a self-indulgent lover. And Eryximachus believes this, or he stresses this point, because he believes the goal of the expert in any field is to create harmony, and he relates this to the function of Eros. Aristophanes' speech then offers an imagistic and mythological explanation that nevertheless continues this line of thought, in that Aristophanes presents love as an attempt to reconstruct the original unity, that lovers come together to create this harmony, this synthesis, balancing, restoration of healthy oneness. And so even though he takes our focus back from the role of Eros as a universal force acting on the whole world, his myth fleshes out the nature of how Eros acts on human beings, given the understanding we have developed in all of the three speeches since Phaedrus' speech. Humans wish to live a shared life with one another, such they're even willing to die for the ones they love. Why? Because it's the nature of all things to seek an original harmony. And this is the force of Eros upon the whole world. And the way this manifests in human beings is our desire for closeness and companionship with one another, this attraction, this devotion to one another, out of a desire to become whole again. And that even involves wanting to die and go to the underworld with them, rather than be separated. After the speech of Aristophanes, there's some brief dialogue and discussion between the various participants before Agathon takes the center stage to give his speech. But the final three speeches, alas, I will be covering these next week in the second part of the episode, because you see, much like the original powerful human beings of old, this podcast episode may have been born 3 hours long and 2 episodes worth of content together in a single unity, but it was just too powerful that way. So I, not unlike Zeus, had to split it into 2. And I know none of my audience will be happy until the first episode is reunited with the second, and the whole lecture finally finds wholeness. But for that, you'll have to come back next week here at the Nietzsche podcast. Thanks for listening. Signing off. Throughout the first 4 speeches of the symposium, the speakers continue grasping forward through a series of different perspectives, and in the process, they gradually produce a more complete view of the god Eros. Eros is the god who was understood by the Greek culture to be the force of love, as we talked about last week, and Eros manifests within mankind wherever people become stricken with love. Moving from Phaedrus' initial speech to that of Pausianus, Eryximachus, and Aristophanes, an image begins to form of the god, which becomes more refined and complex as we continue. Each man adds some element working from the premises of the previous speakers. Whether those premises are agreed upon or refuted, but either way, they work off of the premises of the previous speakers in order to refine the idea of what the power of love actually is, and therefore how it is that the god of love, Eros, is indeed a great god, which was the purpose of the speeches they're giving, the eulogy, the encomium, right? It's a style of speaking designed to praise a deity. Now, I should note here, not everyone agrees with the idea that these speeches build upon one another. If you read the Penguin Classics edition of the Symposium, for example, and read the introduction by Christopher Gill, you'll get the viewpoint that the speeches which appear before the speech of Socrates, they're subpar, they're confused, they're vague, they're pretentious, or they're just, they're flat out wrong. The underlying argumentative thrust of the Symposium to Christopher Gill is that it's the intention of ridiculing the other interlocutors at the event in order to glorify Socrates, right? That was what he would allege Plato's trying to do. But this interpretation of the speeches so far that I have given, a progression wherein each man works together to bring forward a more complete picture of Eros, is not my own, but Friedrich Nietzsche's. And we know because he writes about it in the essay on the relationship of Alcibiades' speech to the rest of the speeches in Plato's Symposium, which Nietzsche wrote in 1864, which that would have been the last year that Nietzsche studied at Schulpforta. And at this point, he was firmly on the philological track and immersed in his studies of the Greeks. It's a very short essay, and so we'll probably end up reading through most, if not the whole thing, over the course of this episode. But at this point, before we move on to the last three speeches, I want to give you the story so far in Nietzsche's words. And this is from the second paragraph of the essay, translated by Andy Davis. Quote, Phaedrus's speech sketches only the area in which the question moves. He describes Eros as the oldest god and as the author of the greatest goods. Naturally, I pass over the meaning of the individual speeches for the personality of the speakers and emphasize the fundamental thought. Pausanias explains Eros, the heavenly god, as love, which has as its purpose the active and passive refinement of human beings. Whereas the first two speakers present love only in its effect on human beings, Eryximachus broadens the meaning of Eros to include the universal life of nature. Aristophanes says that a natural necessity lies at the root of Eros, the law of attraction, end quote. And the word for law of attraction is Wahlverwandtschaft. So Nietzsche sees each speaker working in this procession to take the topic and refine it, or to broaden it, refocus it, basically, we could say. But, not insofar as they simply refute or disagree outright with one another. And Nietzsche thinks that a central principle is at work in each speech, which represents the personality of the person speaking and the fundamental thought behind their speech. So, for example, it's only natural that Eryximachus should broaden Eros to include the world of nature, which, as that's the world of biology and physiology, and thus within his domain as a practitioner of medicine. And it's only natural that Aristophanes, the playwright, should offer us a fanciful, comedic story in the place of his own speech. But the progression, again, is Phaedrus establishes the topic. Pausanias talks about Eros in terms of love, not just in terms of the god, makes the distinction of higher and lower love. Eryximachus expands the concept to universal terms that go beyond humanity. And finally, Aristophanes defines those universal terms by characterizing the universal Eros, albeit in an allegorical way, as the Wahlverwandtschaft, or the law of attraction. So in the story, which we'll now continue with, the next speaker is the host of the party, Agathon, whom we have not heard from yet. Before we get into his speech in depth, I'm going to read what Nietzsche, how he defines what Agathon's contribution to the dialogue is. Quote, Agathon finally calls Eros the love of the beautiful, which brings forth everything good and great in nature, in art, everywhere, end quote. So, established before Agathon's speech, we have the idea of Eros as this force that seeks to reconstruct an original unity or an ideal harmony across all of nature, expressed as the universal law of attraction. Then Agathon comes forth and looks beneath this law of attraction, or at least this is what he purports to do in his speech, and as Nietzsche says, he defines it as love of the beautiful. And he begins his speech notably by challenging the previous speakers and suggesting they have not praised Eros as thoroughly as possible because they have praised him for his effect on human beings, rather than speaking of the character of Eros himself. So they have talked of the work of Eros, the effect of Eros, the manifestations of Eros, how people are willing to die for their lovers, how one who pursues an art or a craft while possessed by Eros will seek to create that Erotean harmony, or how human beings want nothing more than to find, closeness and companionship with one another. But this is all discussion of ourselves and not the God himself, right? This is Agathon's critique of the speakers who come before him. It's his way of suggesting that he's speaking of something even more fundamental than this universal law of attraction that Aristophanes puts forward. Because you could say that Aristophanes is again speaking of the effect, right? The key to understanding this universal law of attraction is within the attributes and the inner character of the god himself. And so he declares he will speak of Eros himself, of the inner nature of Eros, and this nature is the love of the beautiful. Agathon's speech, therefore, is a penetration into deeper depths, into the foundation of all those good and praiseworthy effects on humankind, this law of attraction in terms of its inner character. We might call it a will to beauty, to use Nietzschean terminology. Agathon also goes on in his speech to quibble with the other speakers on a few other points. Perhaps the most significant is his first major quarrel, which is with Phaedrus, because Phaedrus claimed that Eros was the oldest deity, predating all of the major pantheon of ancient Greece, and that without his force acting upon this world, there would not have been procreation, that, Eros is responsible for all of these early deeds of the gods. And Agathon says he does not believe this, and that if it was love that led to the primordial generations of gods, quote, the gods would not have imprisoned or castrated each other or done those many other acts of violence, end quote. Referencing to sordid stories in Greek myths. Agathon's conclusion is that we have confused love with what he calls necessity, arguing, quote, the things that gods did to each other in ancient times, which Hesiod and Parmenides report, happened because of necessity and not love, end quote. Therefore, he argues that love is not the oldest among the divinities, but the youngest, and furthermore that Eros is always and eternally the youngest among the gods. So again, Nietzsche's argument in interpreting this is certainly not that the speakers don't disagree with one another, right? Because Agathon very clearly disagrees with the view of Phaedrus here, and he overturns one of the pillars, the main pillar, you could say, of Phaedrus's praise. Agathon then proceeds to give praise to the deity himself and speak of love's characteristics as one who dwells in the softest things and in the softest hearts, as one who's infinitely graceful. And because of his eternal youth, Eros is also supremely beautiful. And so the image here is of Eros as beautiful and that one that inhabits the beautiful. You could say that within Agathon's framework, beauty itself is a manifestation of Eros. In the course of his speech, where he argues to correlate love with beauty, he wishes to associate Eros with everything beautiful. And so he says, quote, his beauty of complexion is shown by the fact that he spends his time among flowers. Love does not settle on a body or mind or anything that has no bloom or has lost its bloom. But when he finds somewhere full of bloom and fragrance, there he settles and stays, end quote. The idea of something blooming, something in bloom, that's a very rich metaphor because it speaks to us just as much of the beauty of youth as of freshness, having vigor, vitality, something freshly coming into being, something flowering, right? And so Agathon, he addresses the speeches of some of the other interlocutors besides Phaedrus as well. So he argues that Eros possesses the supreme virtues of justice, of moderation, and of wisdom. When he speaks of the moderation of Eros, he alludes to the speech of Eryximachus, and then he says that to honor his own expertise, just as Eryximachus honored his, that Eros, quote, is so skilled a poet that he makes others into poets, end quote. And he goes on to say, quote, certainly as regards the production of living things, who will deny that it is by love's skill that all living things come into being and are produced? As for expertise in art or craft, don't we know that whoever is taught by this god ends up being famous and conspicuous, while whoever is untouched by the god is obscure, end quote. So again, here Agathon capitulates to the claims of other speakers that Eros is responsible for not just human sexuality, but the production of all living things, and also the production of all sort of creative works, all enterprises of arts and crafts. He goes on to say that Apollo himself was a student of Eros. But again, the reorientation that Agathon has in mind is to focus on the essence of the god himself on the traits and qualities of Eros and on the inner character of Eros. And thus Agathon reinterprets these claims by suggesting what it means to say that Eros creates these things, as to say the love of the beautiful created these things. And that's what it means when the muse enters the artisan or the craftsman. He gains the perspective to see and bring forth the beautiful, to seek after the beautiful. It's through that love of the beautiful that the harmony that Eryximachus spoke of is created. So again, Eryximachus, in Agathon's view, was merely speaking of the effect. Here he's speaking of the inner character, the inner nature of Eros. And so Agathon concludes as such for his speech, quote, "So it seems to me, Phaedrus, that love is himself supreme in beauty and excellence, and is responsible for similar qualities in others. I feel moved to express this in verse and say that he is one who makes peace among humankind and windless calm at sea, rest for the winds and sleep for those distressed. Love drains us of estrangement and fills us with familiarity, causing us to come together in all shared gatherings like this and acting as our leader in festival, chorus, and sacrifice. He includes mildness and excludes wildness. He is generous of goodwill and ungenerous of ill will. He is gracious and kindly, gazed on by the wise, admired by the gods, craved by those denied him, treasured by those enjoying him." End quote. So it seems Agathon has knocked it out of the park and tied together all of these disparate threads of the many eulogies given. And the narrator tells us that after he finishes speaking, there is an electric response to Agathon's speech. Remember, this man is a well-loved poet and playwright, and, he just had his first tragedy performed. It seems the man is on fire. He's just, he's displaying once again that he is this great poet in front of this very respected, conspicuous company here. And so it says in the text, quote, "After Agathon had finished his speech, Aristodemus said, 'There were shouts of admiration from everyone present, because the young man had spoken in a way that reflected well on himself and on the god.'" End quote. Out in the bit there about Aristodemus said, it's, the narrator, Apollodorus, recounting what he heard from Aristodemus, who was actually there. But of course, so the speech of Socrates is coming next. And given that this is a dialogue of Plato, this should probably clue you into the fact that Agathon is about to be made to look rather pedestrian in comparison. Socrates begins by praising the speech of Agathon and expressing a sort of ironic hesitation at having to follow Agathon's speech. This is why Socrates is called the great ironist by Nietzsche. He often gives praise of the intelligence or abilities of others that appears to be sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek, But so Socrates expresses here, he doesn't think he can measure up to the tremendous speeches that have already been given. He says he cannot guarantee he will have a good speech if he's forced to continue in the style of eulogistic speaking, and argues that he must approach his speech in a slightly different way. He says that if the goal is merely to offer praise of Eros, this imposes a limit on the type of things that each man can say. It means that the appearance of praise must at all times be given, regardless of whether such praise is true. Socrates, of course, cares more about whether what he says is true than whether what he says offers praise. And so he says he'll only give his speech if he's allowed to be completely honest, and everyone present agrees. Because, of course, they want to hear what Socrates has to say. Who wouldn't? And he then asks if he can ask a few questions of Agathon before he begins speaking. Socrates' MO, and everyone agrees to this as well. Socrates starts, therefore, by cross-examining Agathon in order to establish a few basic premises for the argument he's about to make. He argues that somebody cannot be called a father unless they are a father to someone, a father to a child. Same is true of a mother or a brother or a sister. Any familial relationship, right? One must be a brother to a sibling. Somebody with no siblings, therefore, can't be a brother. And so on and so forth. One is defined as being this thing, this role, on the basis of a relationship that exists to someone else. Socrates gets Agathon to agree with all these premises, and then Socrates asks the million-dollar question. Quote, "Now try to tell me about love," Socrates said. "Is love the love of nothing or the love of something?" "Well, of something, undoubtedly." "For the moment," Socrates said, "keep to yourself and bear in mind what love is of. But tell me this much. Does love desire what it is the love of, or not?" "Yes," he said. "Think about it," Socrates said. "Surely it's not just probable, but necessary that desire is directed at something you need, and that if you don't need something, you don't desire it." "I think so too," said Agathon. "That's right. Now, would anyone who was tall want to be tall, or anyone who was strong want to be strong? Well, that's impossible, according to what we've agreed already." "Yes, because no one is in need of qualities he already has." End quote. Socrates then goes on to elaborate about why it is wanting something you already have is an incoherent idea. He really hammers this home, which Agathon continues to agree with. We'll skip over the lengthy arguments in that respect to where this is all summarized succinctly by Socrates at the end. Quote, "Desire and love are directed at what you don't have, what isn't there, and what you need." End quote. Socrates extracts agreement from Agathon on this point and then continues to press home the argument. He says Agathon's already agreed that love is love of the beautiful, and that the affairs of gods are arranged according to the principle of the love of beautiful things, and that no one could love what it is that is ugly. And Agathon agrees to all these points as well. And finally, Socrates makes the famous Greek association of the beautiful with the good, and gets Agathon to agree to this also, that being in need of beautiful things necessarily means being in need of good things. For if what was beautiful was not good for us, we would of course not value it, and we wouldn't seek after it. And after all, Agathon cannot really disagree with him on this point, because all of the men present have made speeches asserting the idea that Eros is behind all of these good things in mankind. That was sort of what they were compelled to do by the fact that they were giving speeches where they had to praise Eros, right? And so that, Eros, this will to beauty, is this force making mankind better and more virtuous. And so, of course, it's good. But all of this means, inevitably, that given the other arguments that Agathon has been led to agree with by Socrates, that if Eros is the love of the beautiful, Eros must not himself possess beauty. He can't be beautiful himself, because loving the beautiful, desiring the beautiful, means you don't have beauty. And by that token, that means he must not possess what is good either. And so in the cross-examination before Socrates' speech even begins, Socrates has more or less said that all of the things everyone said praising Eros about how good Eros is, how wonderful Eros is, that Eros is not good. And so it's not a very promising start for Socrates. But, so in any case, Socrates has gotten Agathon, the speaker who everyone praised most heartily after his speech. He's gotten him to agree that the central ideas of his speech are wrong, that Eros is himself not beautiful, not virtuous, not good. And if he represents the seeking after those things, then he can't possess them. And so we can understand why people tend to interpret Socrates as tearing down the speeches of the men who spoke after him, because it would seem that unfortunately all of their premises have been undermined. Agathon goes along with all this, as people usually do with Socrates, saying that he can't argue with him. And who can blame Agathon? Who would want to argue with Socrates? To which Socrates responds, quote, "It's the truth you can't argue with, my dear friend Agathon. It's not at all difficult to disagree with Socrates." End quote. So Socrates has held to his promise to speak the truth, even if it would seem to violate the need to give praise to Eros. And so where can Socrates proceed from here? Socrates' next move, upon beginning his speech, is to use ethos. He's already used the path of logos as the weapon of his criticism, right? But here he appeals to a spiritual authority, bringing in the voice of Diotima of Mantinea. Diotima is a priestess of Eros that Socrates says he once had a dialogue with, when in the past he went to her in order to inquire about the nature of Eros. So, given that the symposium is presented as a third-hand account already, so it's being told to the audience by Apollodorus, who heard it from Aristodemus, Socrates now makes it a fourth-hand account, as we're now hearing from Apollodorus what Aristodemus heard Socrates say, that he heard Diotima say. So this has led people to endlessly speculate as to whether or not Diotima is even real. Maybe she didn't even exist and Socrates made her up. Maybe she's just a rhetorical technique, right? Or maybe Plato made her up, because maybe Plato made up the entire dialogue. Or maybe these are all entirely real people and we're just getting a fourth-hand account. We'll leave all of these impossible to resolve puzzles aside for the purposes of the podcast. Whatever the reality of the situation, the effect of presenting his argument as a recounting of a dialogue with Diotima of Mantinea is that Socrates can therefore evade the sorts of mental obstacles or mental blocks that people might have and that might arise if his arguments were considered to be just blasphemous. I mean, he's just suggested Eros is not good or young or beautiful, and now he can elaborate on what it means while offering the arguments as if they're the words of an oracular priestess, someone who's not by any means a blasphemer, but, a knower of the holiest, most secret truths. The effect, again, whether this is a genuine dialogue that Socrates presents or not, it may well be. The effect is to clue his audience into the fact that he does not intend to make an attack upon Eros. This is mostly my opinion here. But, he's redefining the terms of the conversation, and he's trying to indicate to everyone who is thus far spoken as to how the words they have uttered have come very far short of the reality. Some interpreters have also suggested this could be Socrates' way of appealing to the pride of Agathon and to the pride of the other speakers. For Socrates is saying, look, Agathon, the same arguments that I just put to you were put to me by Diotima. I used to think the same wrong things that you thought. I was just as ignorant as all of you are, but Diotima set me straight. Therefore, it's not that I'm this particularly clever man in comparison to you, but I was outwitted by someone else who had an insight into the same truth, right? And I'm just sort of relating what they said. And so ironically, I think that's a completely valid argument, that it serves to undercut the mental block of people's pride. But it's this kind of magnanimity that Socrates shows that ironically serves to further set Socrates above everyone else. And that's sort of it's an intellectual or rhetorical judo trick that Socrates often pulls. So Socrates then relates what was said between himself and the priestess. Effectively, what Socrates does, he continues the dialogue that he began with Agathon, right? Only now he's doing the dialogue all by himself. And now he's relating a dialogue that he had. And it roughly corresponds to Socrates is basically in Agathon's role and Diotima is in the role of Socrates. It's basically as if Socrates said, well, okay, clearly you're just, agreeing to whatever I say, because you don't want to argue with me. So I'm just going to continue to dramatize a dialogue and relate to you the story of what Diotima told me. So Socrates now goes on relating this dialogue. Quote, I said, what do you mean, Diotima? Is Eros ugly and bad then? She said, what blasphemy! Do you think that anything which isn't beautiful must necessarily be ugly? I certainly do. And must anything that isn't wise be ignorant? Haven't you realized that there's something between wisdom and ignorance? End quote. Skipping a little further down in the passage, Diotima elaborates, quote, "Don't think that what isn't beautiful must be ugly, and that what isn't good must be bad. In the same way, when you yourself agree that Eros is neither good nor beautiful, don't suppose he must therefore be ugly and bad, but something in between the two." End quote. And so in the course of the dialogue, Diotima then gets Socrates to admit that if Eros is not in the possession of good and beautiful things, then he cannot be a god. Because after all, Eros is in need of, or in the business of seeking after, good and beautiful things, which means he doesn't have them, which means he's not good or beautiful in and of himself. And Socrates also agrees it would be blasphemous to say that a god could exist who is not beautiful and happy. Which means, of course, Eros cannot be a god. And so once again, Socrates protests, quote, "But what could Eros be? A mortal?" "Far from it," Diotima answers. "What then?" "Like those examples discussed earlier, he's between mortal and immortal." "What does that make him, Diotima?" "He is a great spirit, Socrates. Everything classed as a spirit falls between God and human." "What function do they have?" I asked. "They interpret and carry messages from humans to gods, and from gods to humans. They convey prayers and sacrifices from humans, and commands and gifts in return from gods. Being intermediate between the other two, they fill the gap between them and enable the universe to form an interconnected whole. They serve as the medium for all divination, for priestly expertise in sacrifice, rituals, and spells, and for all prophecy and sorcery. Gods do not make direct contact with humans. They communicate and converse entirely through the medium of spirits. Someone whose wisdom lies in these areas is a man of the spirit, while wisdom in other areas of expertise and craftsmanship makes one merely a mechanic. There are many spirits of very different types, and one of them is Eros." End quote. And so now we finally see here how Socrates continues the arguments of the previous speakers while completely reinterpreting what it is that all of them have been speaking about. Socrates reframes the discussion. We're not here to give praise to a god, because Eros is not a god at all. If Eros were a god, it would be a blasphemy to define him as the love of the beautiful, which is the conclusion that the series of speeches had arrived at before Socrates even uttered a word, by the way. They arrived at something which Socrates exposes as being blasphemous. Saying the premises underlying all the things that you have said, that you have all built up to, is actually to denigrate the god of Eros, right? Because if ultimately the foundation of all this is the love of the beautiful, then you're saying that Eros is an ugly god. But this is why Socrates depersonifies Eros. He's not a god, he's a spirit. Another way of saying this might be, if we were to put it in a more modern language, Eros is a force, or Eros is a will. Through this redefining of what Eros is, it allows Socrates to speak of Eros, of the power of love, in terms which are at once more abstract, but also more honest and more explicit. Eros, more straightforward, that's really the word I'm looking for. So Eros is defined as a relationship, as something which exists as an intercessor between, it could be between two beings, the lover and the beloved, between mankind, but between God and man is the example that he just cited Diotima using. So Eros, the love of the beautiful, it's a mediating force. It's not a personified god that arose at a particular time. Although, to be fair, Socrates does give, through Diotima, an alternative explanation, mythological explanation for the origins of Eros in their remarks immediately following this. He says Eros is the child of resource and poverty. So, in allegorical terms, love is the mediating force by which those with a great need find the resourcefulness to seek after that need. But this is all symbolic. I mean, immediately after this description, Socrates goes on to reiterate that Eros is neither mortal nor immortal, but is a thing that shoots into and out of life, manifests here and there, but neither endures forever nor fades away forever. And so Eros is beginning to look more and more like this well, again, by depersonifying Eros, right? They've been speaking of Eros as this universal force. By depersonifying him, he can make Eros this force that's part of all things. It's literally shoots into and out of all things that are alive. You would even say in modern, in comparative philosophy, right? In modern comparative philosophy, we might be able to look at Eros as being similar to the Tao, the way in Taoist philosophy, insofar as Eros is not a being or entity himself, but a pattern, a way that all things behave, something that exists within all of these phenomena, not an independent phenomenon himself. Or we could grab a comparison a bit closer at hand to Greek philosophy. We might consider the way that Heraclitus uses the term logos, a natural pattern, a rhythm that moves through all things. But so the reason why Eros makes possible all of the things that the other speakers at the symposium attributed to his influence, such as pursuing virtue or mastering an art or a craft, is that Eros is the thing between ignorance and wisdom. As Socrates says, or rather, as he relates to us, that Diotima says, the wise do not wish for wisdom because they already have it. But it's not as if the ignorant desire to have wisdom either, because that's why they remain ignorant. It's not wisdom in and of itself that seeks after wisdom, but ignorance in and of itself doesn't seek after wisdom either. So what is it? It's Eros. It's the relationship mediating between ignorance and wisdom. So Diotima then says, quote, wisdom is one of the most beautiful things, and Eros is the love of beauty. So Eros must necessarily be a lover of wisdom, and a lover of wisdom, he falls between wisdom and ignorance. End quote. So, once again, this very interesting logical technique that we're using to identify Eros as this mediating thing. But notice specifically what we're talking about here. A lover of wisdom is what? Philos, love, Sophia, wisdom. So Socrates presents Eros as not just a spirit, but a philosopher, right? And we might consider with the term spirit too, psyche, the association of spirit with the mind, with consciousness, right? And so that is rather apropos for the way Socrates would describe what Eros is, but we might say that he's kind of describing him almost as like the spirit of philosophy here. That wisdom is the most beautiful thing, because wisdom's the thing that allows us to understand what it is that's truly beautiful. It's arguments like this one that I think lead people to suggest that Socrates might have just made Diotima up, because this argument sounds very similar to the ones that Socrates likes to give. Oftentimes in his dialogue, Socrates' conclusions tend to be variations on the theme of the philosopher's life as the most virtuous, or of philosophy as the highest good. Of course, that's an affirmation of his own type of person. And so that being said, again, perhaps Diotima was real, and maybe the reason why it's the kind of argument that Socrates likes to give is because maybe he was influenced by Diotima. Again, it really doesn't matter. But notice that Socrates has at this point capitulated to many of the main points that were rounded off by the speech of Agathon. He's refined the argument most completely by bringing it into abstract and philosophical terms and out of the religious, which in itself, it undermines all the core themes of Agathon's speech, but at the same time, in a dialectical maneuver, it carries forward the same concerns of the previous speeches of what love is, And the way they've gone about this, of defining love's impact on human lives, and then love's effect on all nature, and then the inner character of love, Socrates then takes it further to where our perspective as to what we're talking about when we're talking about the nature of love is that we're talking about an intermediating force, not a god. We're talking about a relationship of attraction. And so that tells us that the inner character of love is ultimately, if it is the love of the beautiful, it's the love of wisdom, because wisdom is the most beautiful of all beautiful things. And the reason why is because it's only through wisdom that Socrates is able to even understand all of the things that he's just explained to us about love, right? Go back to Nietzsche's 1864 essay. I'm going to jump back, actually, before the paragraph I read before, to the very first paragraph Nietzsche writes about the symposium, which I think will be helpful here. Because Nietzsche states his underlying point immediately, which means that Nietzsche displays more talent for brevity than I do. Quote, "To get to the point immediately concerning how I think about the relationship between the first 5 speeches and Socrates' speech, it seems to me the claim that Plato has only brought together inadequate perspectives on Eros in order to present Socrates' speech over and against them as the only correct one is completely in error. Socrates himself does not deny these speeches their accolades. He comes back to many things in them as he assigns each single perspective its own due place. Much more, I believe that from the first speech to the last, a decisive progress takes place insofar as each successive perspective increases and broadens the previous perspective in some essential aspect. The individual speakers see the concept of Eros emerge with growing clarity until in the end Socrates takes the cumulatively developed building and only rounds it off with a dome. He does not destroy it. Naturally, this is valid only with respect to the fundamental perspective of each speaker. Whatever was added as ornament to their developments is rejected by Socrates in many ways as unjustified." End quote. And so that is just it. What Socrates rejects is the ornamentation, the attempts of the speakers to give as much appearance of praise for Eros as they could. Remember the issue that Socrates draws attention to at the beginning of his speech and says he won't indulge in, the obligation for the appearance of praise. And therefore, what Socrates is doing is pulling the gems out of each speech, the most beautiful parts, which are to say the insightful parts, or their wisdom, you could say, right? Each speech contributes some central idea, which to Socrates is the most important thing. The poetic verses, the mythical stories, loquacious exaltations, all of this is not what Socrates finds beautiful. He's looking for the bits of wisdom he can string together to produce this coherent, rational account of what they're talking about. So one way that Socrates addresses Pausanias' wisdom, for example, is in this section, where Diotima argues, quote, "Why don't we say that everyone is a lover, if everyone always loves the same things? Why do we call some people lovers and not others?" End quote. And a little skipping further down in the passage, quote, "What we're doing is picking out one kind of love and applying it to the name love that belongs to the whole class, while we use different names for other kinds of love." End quote. So Pausanias was the first to raise the issue that there might be multiple types of love confounded under a single label. Socrates then puts forward the idea here that, as Anaximachus also argued, Eros is behind every type of craft, every type of human effort. He specifically mentions musical composition, but we don't call these people lovers, per se. We don't tend to speak in the language of saying that what the composer or the mechanic is doing is loving. So further down, Diotima continues, quote, "Eros is the whole desire of good things and of being happy, the greatest and all-beguiling Eros. But those who turn toward it in many other ways, in terms of either money-making, love of gymnastics, or philosophy, are neither said to love nor called lovers, whereas those who earnestly apply themselves to a single certain kind get the name of the whole, love, and are said to love and are called lovers." End quote. I should clarify, she sort of means this as a criticism, right, of how ignorant we are. So we may notice that what's beginning to take shape here could be compared to Nietzsche's idea of one fundamental force, one fundamental will that motivates everything, and that drives everything in human life and within nature. In Nietzsche's formulation, that's the will to power. However, arguably, we've already had some concept of a fundamental force in the form of the universal law of attraction or the love of the beautiful. That's already appeared in the previous speeches. But in the picture that Socrates gives us in his speech, the key parallel between Eros as given by Diotima and the will to power that Nietzsche would later coin is that both are presented as a force that manifests itself in other ways in the form of what we might call sublimations. So just as Nietzsche says, our will to truth, to seek the truth, that's a sublimation of our will to power. Diotima argues that the love of the craftsman for his craft, his desire, that's really a desire to attain wisdom, to attain virtue in his craft, and so on and so forth. Again, using virtue in the Greek sense of the word, which we talked about last week. This is also, that's a sublimation. It's driven by the same mediating force of Eros, or the love of the beautiful, which means, of course, inherently the love of what is good, what is wise, what is virtuous. So the craftsman, doing his woodworking is actually a lover. It's just we don't recognize that. We don't see that. So Diotima continues, quote, "There is a certain account according to which those who seek their own halves are lovers. But my speech denies that Eros is of a half or of a whole, unless that half or whole can be presumed to be really good. For human beings are willing to have their own feet and hands cut off if they think that those parts of themselves are diseased," end quote. And again, that's obviously an answer to a previous speech, in this case, Aristophanes. But again, in concrete terms, the premise of that speech is denied, that Eros as this intermediating force leads men from ignorance to wisdom and from ugliness to beauty and from wickedness to virtue. It can't be understood in this way, that the desire to bond with another human being cannot be explained as simply the desire to restore an original unity. Socrates redefines the desire to forge these bonds as the desire to bring forth something good. To say that we are just the other halves of one another's bodies doesn't mean on the face of it that we would necessarily want to become whole with those other halves, if the union wouldn't produce something good, if it wouldn't produce something of value. Here, meaning would not help us in our seeking after the beautiful. And the evidence that he uses is that we would even cut off our own limbs if they became, quote, bad, right? Or diseased is the way this translation has it, but really in another translation it just says if we would cut our own hands and feet off if we were to think that those parts were bad. We might consider the example of cutting off a gangrenous limb, which is something that physicians often found to be necessary in past times. So the idea is that wholeness in and of itself is not good just because it's wholeness. That occasionally you may need to cleave off a part of the whole for the good of the whole. So the motivating force in people coming together and having romantic love and producing children must be understood as purely this instinct, this drive towards the good. It's not simply a desire to create wholeness, because wholeness is not in and of itself good. A key aspect of this insight is that love is redefined from something which is about restoring what was lost, right? Which may be like an unintended consequence, a view that you would be maybe inclined to hold as a result of Agathon's speech. But now we're looking at love as something different. Now it's about generating something new. So Diotima goes on to describe sexual relations and the birth of children as a divine thing. And this divine process is how human beings attain immortality, how they attain to what is eternal. So Diotima then addresses the speech all the way back at the beginning, the speech of Phaedrus, who focused on the willingness of lovers to die for the ones they love. And so, of course, we have now expanded this observation to include all of nature. And we've now refined what this Eros is and what we are going to say is responsible for this willingness to give up one's life. And so Diotima says, and I'm quoting here in an abridged form, quote, "What do you believe is the cause of this Eros and desire? Or aren't you aware how uncanny is the disposition of all the beasts whenever they desire to produce offspring? They are all ill and of an erotic disposition, first concerning actual intercourse with one another, then later concerning the nurture of what is generated. And they are ready to fight to the finish, the weakest against the strongest, for the sake of those they have generated, and to die on their behalf. And they are willingly racked by starvation, and stop at nothing to nourish their offspring. One might suppose that human beings do this from calculation. But as for the beasts, what is the cause of their erotic disposition being of this sort?" End quote. So again, there's a refusal to reduce this divine Eros to anything resembling an instinct for preserving or restoring, right? Eros is about generating. What we have here is perhaps another parallel then to Nietzsche's will to power idea, that Eros is the power within all life that seeks after the good. And here we have it clearly explained that what's good for life is not always to preserve itself. Just as one doesn't wish to simply preserve a limb that is diseased and will kill the whole, or in the way a mother or father, whether human or animal, will die to protect their children, like their offspring. Eros has an element that is self-overcoming and self-transformative and about generating. It's not simply aimed at the continuation of life as it is, but in bringing forth the good, bringing forth wisdom. Diotima elaborates further, and as her explanation continues, these characteristics of Eros, when considered altogether, give way to the understanding of what Eros is, what it truly is. We seek after the beautiful. Why? Because the beautiful is good? Well, yes, but on a deeper level, why is it good? It's because within the beautiful we create the good, right? We give rise to the good. But what is this? What is this good that everyone seeks after? And the answer, the key to all of this, is immortality, as we've hinted at. And so Diotima then explains. And again, I've abridged this quote in a couple places. Quote, "In the Eros of the beasts, in terms of the same argument as that concerning men, the mortal nature seeks as far as possible to be forever and immortal. Mortal nature is capable of immortality only in this way, the way of generation, because it is always leaving behind another that is young to replace the old. For while each one of the animals is said to live and be the same, for example, one is spoken of as the same from the time one is a child until one is an old man, though he never has the same things in himself. Nevertheless, he is called the same. He is forever becoming young in some respects, as he suffers losses in other respects, his hair, flesh, bones, blood, and his whole body. And this is so not only in terms of the body, but also in terms of the soul. His ways, character, opinions, desires, pleasures, pains, fears. Each of these things is never present as the same for each, but they are partly coming to be and partly perishing. And what is far stranger still is that in the case of our sciences too, not only are some coming to be while others are perishing. For studying, as it is called, is done on the grounds that the science is passing out from us. For forgetfulness is the exiting of science, and studying, by instilling a fresh memory again to replace the departing one, preserves the science. For in this way every mortal thing is preserved, not by being absolutely the same forever, as the divine is, but by the fact that that which is departing and growing old leaves behind another young thing that is as it was. By this device the mortal shares in immortality, both body and all the rest. But the immortal has a different way. So do not be amazed if everything honors by nature its own offshoot, for it is for the sake of immortality that this zeal and Eros attain everything." End quote. Sorry, attend everything. I screwed up the end of the quote. But whatever, you get the gist. So So much in this passage is, I think, incredibly important. What Diotima describes as the fundamental change of Eros is the drive to seek after immortality, or what we might call a will to eternity, or a will to eternalize. It's undoubtedly an influence on Nietzsche, insofar as Nietzsche would later express in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that all who say yes to life and its joys want deep, profound eternity of all things. The ultimate affirmation of life, the ultimate good of life, is to will for it to go on forever. But Diotima is not talking just about what we wish. She's talking about the way things actually are. And so how are things actually? Well, life doesn't go on by being absolutely the same forever, as the gods do. Life is always changing. It's this endless dynamic flux. I mean, this is all this stuff about the body in that passage, and how we have to continually preserve knowledge by, so that's all very, the stuff about forgetfulness is very important to, in comparison to the things Nietzsche later wrote about forgetfulness, about how forgetfulness is this active force, right? And so without this constant renewing, without this constant bringing to mind, the way Diotima puts it, instilling a fresh memory again to replace the departing one, all of our knowledge departs. And so knowledge sort of has to, quote unquote, reproduce in this same way. And so keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that. But again, with even the body, even within the span of a single life and a single individual, your body is not the same the whole time. I mean, what is it, like 7 years? All of your DNA has like completely changed, or every cell in your body has regenerated? I forget what it is. I'm sure you're all familiar with the ship of Theseus parable. The idea of a ship that's had every single part of it replaced, but slowly, one board is pulled up and replaced every single year until however many years later, it's a completely different ship. That's the case even with our own bodies. And it's certainly the case with the human race, right? That people don't live forever, but the human race is still here. It's been here for millions of years. And so, maybe 1 million or 100,000 in our current form. I forget exactly what the number might be. But, we replace ourselves every, generation. And so this is how mortals strive after immortality. And Eros is that same mediating force that's allowing mankind to pursue what is eternal, even as we're subject to arising and passing away. That's how we pursue wisdom, even though we're always forgetting, and our knowledge is always fleeing from our minds. The bridge between the mortal and the immortal, between ignorance and wisdom, between ugliness and the beautiful. That is the ultimate good that wise people see in Eros. The drive from what was incomplete or faulty to that which is perfect. The great drive in mankind to seek after the eternal, even as we partake in these temporary mortal lives. And so Diotima concludes, and she recapitulates here to Passianus, that there are multiple ways of mortals creating the good or bringing forth the good. And while this applies to having children, it also applies to what we might call pregnancy of the spirit, or of being pregnant with wisdom and insight. Because remember, wisdom is the most beautiful thing, and that's because it gives rise to the greatest good. And if the good we're all seeking is immortality, wisdom gives rise to the greatest approximation of immortality. Creations of the mind are another form of offspring, different from children. But we might say that the offspring of the mind can remain, quote unquote, alive, so to speak, for centuries or millennia, unlike flesh and blood. So Diotima describes as someone like a wise mentor, that, Passianus talked about this, could be like a partner that could help birth someone else's wisdom into the world. And so again, we have the idea of Eros in the physical sense as a common form of Eros, which is aimed at giving rise to offspring, seeking physical beauty, giving physical birth, creating goodness in the physical sense. And remember, that's what Socrates kind of starts out saying, that it's but the love of the beautiful brings forth the good. We go, it's by joining with the beautiful, or something like that. I mean, you can think about that in a very simple, straightforward, coarse, we might say vulgar. Remember, vulgar, the old meaning means common. We could think about it in those terms. What does it mean to say you generate the good within the beautiful? It means you find a beautiful partner, the most beautiful one you can manage, and together you generate offspring with that person, right? And that's what's good, because that is the human attempt at immortality. But then there's this higher divine Eros, which is not for everyone to experience, but for a great few, really. And they give birth to beauty that's immaterial. And because it's immaterial, it partakes even more purely of the eternal. And so it's the same distinction that Pausanias makes, but we're now at a much higher level of understanding. Not just thinking about in terms of the God, the two erote as literal gods, right? Diotima argues in conclusion that the ultimate aim of Eros is the attainment of beauty itself, not beauty as contained within one particular form or another. Or I shouldn't use the word form, because she's really talking about beauty in terms of the theory of the forms. So we might say the idea of beauty. So every manifestation of beauty, which we perceive as just but a glimpse of the true nature of beauty itself, every individual beautiful phenomenon is a mere approximation, which means that true beauty is, in some sense, beauty in the abstract, which is the exact sense in which we're now talking about it, which is only possible if one has been instructed in the ways of philosophy, has learned to separate the idea of the beautiful in and of itself, to separate that from the individual beautiful phenomena, and consider what beauty is that is not contained in specific manifestations, to speak of what is the beautiful. And in the insight of Diotima, we might say, that's wisdom. That can only be arrived at by the union of two minds, just as with physical reproduction too. That you need instruction in the ways of virtue and learning, so that one can give birth to things within the world of ideas. Not subject to the same fleetingness as the world of nature. And so Diotima says, quote, "This is the right method of approaching the ways of love or being led by someone else, beginning from these beautiful things, always to go up with the aim of reaching that beauty. Like someone using a staircase, he should go from 1 to 2, and from 2 to all beautiful bodies, and from beautiful bodies to beautiful practices, and from practices to beautiful forms of learning. From forms of learning, he should end up at that form of learning which is of nothing other than that of beauty itself, so he can complete the process of learning what beauty really is. In that form of life, my dear Socrates, if in any, human life should be lived gazing on beauty itself. If you ever saw that, it would seem to be on a different level from gold and clothes and beautiful boys and young men. Don't you realize that it's only in that kind of life, when someone sees beauty with the part that can see it, that he'll be able to give birth not just to images of virtue, since it's not images that he's in touch with, but to true virtue, since it's true beauty that he's in touch with. It's someone who's given birth to true virtue and brought it up, who has the chance of becoming loved by the gods and immortal, if any human being can be immortal." End quote. So that concludes Diotima's speech, and by that token, Socrates' speech. Socrates says that all of these things he learned from Diotima led him to understand that every man should hold a respect for Eros, and that he himself practices the ways of love with great care. And in response to this, Aristodemus says there were words of congratulation for Socrates. And as soon as Socrates is finished speaking, and before Aristophanes chimes in because he wishes to quarrel with Socrates in some point or another, suddenly Alcibiades appears in the scene. Now, Alcibiades is outside and he's drunk, shouting for Agathon. Agathon orders his slaves to go see who it is, and when they bring Alcibiades inside, he has to support himself with the help of the flute girl and a few others standing around him, because he's stumbling and staggering about. Quote, He stood by the door, wearing a thick garland of ivy and violets, with masses of ribbons trailing over his head, and said, "Good evening, gentlemen. Will you let someone who's drunk, very drunk, join your symposium?" End quote. So I mentioned in the last part, Alcibiades is a very important historical figure. He was a general who fought for multiple different nation-states during the Peloponnesian War. Now, eventually, historically, he was exiled, but the symposium is during the time when Alcibiades, he would have been regarded as a great man. He's a statesman, an orator, a military man. In many respects, he's the exact opposite type of person from somebody like Socrates. Socrates was a plebeian and, by all accounts, an ugly person. His life and his craft is entirely intellectual. Socrates is the theoretical man. Alcibiades, on the other hand, is a non-theoretical man. That's the distinction that Nietzsche draws in his first book, Birth of Tragedy, which he'd write 8 years after the 1864 essay, where he discusses different types of theoretical men. He designates Socrates as the alpha, the sort of the original theoretical type. But at the end of that passage, he lists Napoleon as an example of a non-theorist, as he calls him. He also would invoke Goethe, who spoke of the productivity of deeds in contrast to productivity when it comes to writing plays and poems and intellectual productions and so on and so forth. And so Alcibiades is not the kind of man who leaves behind edifices of the mind, like a philosopher. He's the man who does great deeds, who acts in the world, such as by commanding troops, leading the state, and so on. And it's very difficult to describe. Alcibiades would have been so respected and admired and known and famous by everybody in Greek society, right? And yet what happens next at the symposium is quite unexpected if we consider all these things, because upon seeing Socrates, Alcibiades immediately leaps up and becomes like ranting and raving, because Alcibiades, it turns out, is madly in love with Socrates. And this applies not just to the mind of Socrates, but to physical love for him as well. Alcibiades immediately begins just waxing poetic about his unrequited infatuation with Socrates. And when he finds out that all of the men there have been making speeches about love, he declares he will make such a speech also. But rather than praising Eros, Alcibiades says that he's going to make a speech praising Socrates. Alcibiades tells us of how he became smitten with Socrates. He says if he wasn't drunk, he might not speak so freely on the matter, but he confesses his feelings to all present because he is drunk. Following this attraction that he felt to Socrates, he naturally tried to possess him, but found that he couldn't do it. Twice, he recounts in the story, he invited Socrates to his home for dinner, and was planning on making an advance on him afterwards. And the first time, Socrates just leaves immediately as soon as the dinner is finished. And the second time, he manages to get Socrates to stay and spend the night with him. He offers him, he's like, "Oh, it's late, it's you shouldn't walk home now, you can spend the night at my house." And he then makes another advance, and Socrates, of course, resists him again. And thwarts him, he thwarts his attempts to sleep with him. And since Socrates shows himself to be unable to be possessed by Alcibiades, it only makes Alcibiades want Socrates even more. And the more Socrates flees from his advances, the more it makes this great man, this statesman, this man of action, feel inferior to, or feel like a slave to this man, this wise man of no material status or ambition, this philosopher. And so Socrates becomes all the more attractive to Alcibiades, all the more mysterious. And then as he goes on in the speech, he also talks about the virtues of Socrates, how when Socrates was part of a military campaign at Potidæa, he bore the privations of warfare better than anyone else. He showed an endurance and a strength of character that was unmatched. All of these experiences with Socrates showed him a man who was superior to everyone else around him, if not in terms of physical beauty, but in terms of virtue. And so Socrates, even though he's physically ugly, is so beautiful in the sense of his wisdom and his virtue that Alcibiades, who is himself physically beautiful and who is this man of action who lives in the physical world, he finds himself entranced by Socrates, and he can't understand why. And he concludes with the sentiment that there's no other human being like Socrates throughout the past or the present. And his speech, after all the profound discussion beforehand, is met with mostly laughter. Now, the decision to follow up Socrates' seeming finale to the discussion with a drunken love letter of Alcibiades seems to be a strange artistic decision, and I often wondered what exactly was going on here at this part in the story whenever I'd read Symposium in the past. After the speech of Socrates, Alcibiades doesn't really seem to introduce any new ideas. It just kind of derails everything into a bunch of praise for Socrates. And so, that would seem to, if you're going off of the standard view of what Plato is doing in the Symposium, he intends to basically present all of these inferior speeches, and then Socrates comes in and destroys all of the other speakers with facts and logic, and then maybe it would make sense if it was and then we'll just have if you think this is just Platonist propaganda for why Socrates is so great, right? If that's the depth of your interpretation of the story, I guess it kind of makes sense that then you would just write a part where, the greatest man in Athens comes in and talks about how much he loves Socrates. But it was actually reading Nietzsche's interpretation in his essay that unlocked a new understanding for me of why the dialogue ends the way it does. In Nietzsche's interpretation, the reason for Alcibiades appearing just as soon as Socrates' speech is done is that Alcibiades, through his actions, proves the case that Socrates just made. Socrates outlines a view of Eros that, as we said, makes Eros out to be a spirit of philosophy, seeking out of the beautiful in order to give rise to the good, and the most beautiful thing is wisdom. Because, wisdom gives rise to the ultimate good, the good which is most immortal, and which is, immortality is of the highest value for us mortal human beings. And so that ultimate good is synonymous with virtue, the thing that improves and perfects us. That's the effect of Eros that everyone's been talking about. And the wisdom that governs virtue and gives us an understanding of virtue is immortal, and that because it's a thing that doesn't die with any one person. And so Socrates has given us that argument, but Socrates is just a figure. He's just such a figure that is described in the speeches of Socrates, right? Who lives by Eros. He's a philosopher who seeks the truth in order to give rise to the good. And indeed, Socrates' wisdom does live on through eternity. He truly did give birth to philosophical offspring, right? That have outlived the span of any individual human life. But in spite of that beautiful case that Socrates argues, we've yet to prove the case that this is the nature of what love actually is. I mean, Socrates appeals to ethos, but do we believe him? Is diadema real? Is this really a workable definition of love? But then Alcibiades, a beautiful, powerful man, through his drunkenly honest confession of physical love for Socrates, for the object of his desire, which is an ugly lower class but philosophical man, proves that Socrates manifests the Eros. Socrates, through his wisdom, becomes the most beautiful. His intellectual beauty trumps everything else and actually holds physical beauty in its thrall, in the way Alcibiades feels himself to be a slave to his love for Socrates. So Nietzsche, in his essay, gives an account of the whole progression of the Symposium and the central role that the Alcibiades speech plays in it. And so this is a big, long chunk from the middle of the essay, but in a sense, it's the reason why we've spent 2 episodes talking about it, is to just look at this so that now we can talk about what Nietzsche had to say. So, quote, "Phaedrus is, as elsewhere, only the midwife of the successive speeches, but Pausianus, in whose speech one should never let his love for Agathon out of one's sight, shows the human standpoint. As long as one loves something beautiful, be it something corporeal or spiritual. Eryximachus is the lover of everything beautiful as it reveals itself in the whole of nature. Aristophanes stands already on the higher rung of the love of art and science, just as Agathon does, who, it appears to me, receives his higher place from Plato by being a tragic poet, a judgment which we would no longer agree with. The spiritually greater person by far is Aristophanes. Finally, Socrates himself reaches the rung that Diotima designates as the highest, love of the beautiful itself. We do not doubt that he has reached it, but Socrates himself does not say this to us, and it may not fit with his character. Indeed, Socrates describes how he was once caught in the same error as Agathon is until he acquired this great insight. The reader of the dialogue must remain uncertain of the degree to which this love of the beautiful itself has been carried over into Socrates' everyday life. At this point, Alcibiades appears in order to portray the effect of the love of the beautiful itself on human practical life. His appearance presents this love of the beautiful itself discussed by Socrates at work in an individual, and also presents the reciprocal effect that the love-filled person, Alcibiades, has on others, which mirrors the effect that Socrates has on Alcibiades. Here is the reason, then, why Plato chooses Alcibiades in order to describe these effects. If some other one of Socrates' youths had appeared in order to glorify Socrates, the effect would be incomparably weaker. Alcibiades, compared to Socrates, is a complete apostate. He is the young man entirely alienated from philosophy. Socrates' influence in such a person, on, as it were, such a brilliant person, is the most wonderful effect that Plato could have given as a proof of the aforementioned reciprocal effect. So then, Alcibiades knows nothing of the past speeches. To the surprise of the listeners, he traces the practical side of the person under the influence of the beautiful itself, while Socrates traces the theoretical side. Plato presents Alcibiades as drunk to allow him to express himself more freely about things that must be avoided in serious, measured conversation. Mentioning them was necessary, for they were historical facts. Thus, the opposition between Socrates' speech and Alcibiades' speech is noteworthy, like the opposition of their two natures, because both express their deepest feelings, the one through the mouth of a divinely inspired prophetess, the other under the inspiration of wine. Their deepest feelings, which are the same, are for the beautiful itself, one through the idea, the other pointing toward actuality. Socrates is the lover of the beautiful itself, but Alcibiades is also a lover of the beautiful itself. At the same time, what a difference there is in their natures. The one is as ethically sublime as the other is ethically fallen. The one as physically ugly as the other is physically beautiful. The one as sober and self-controlled as the other drunk and excited. It is clear that these points apply as much to the philosophy as to the artistic form of the dialogue. At this point, we should notice that a shift in tone occurs with Alcibiades' entrance. It shows the most daring artistic grasp that in the moment when Socrates has led his listeners to the highest ocean of the beautiful, the reef of drunkenness and enthusiasm bursts upon them, and indeed does not negate the effect of Socrates' speech, but heightens it. Alcibiades' speech is the work of Eros, just as Socrates' speech is. But Alcibiades' speech works through facts, and Socrates' speech works through ideas, and the facts work more powerfully and persuasively than the expressed ideas." End quote. And so Alcibiades' speech, to Nietzsche's mind, is anything but superfluous. It's a masterstroke of the dialogue, the demonstration in action as to what has only been outlined in terms of abstraction. Nietzsche goes on to say that it's through this speech of Alcibiades that Plato binds together all the various speeches in the same way Zeus tied together the human beings in their skins, twisted off the umbilical cord in a knot, right? By considering the two speeches side by side, the theoretical speech of Socrates versus the impassioned speech of Alcibiades, we perceive the double nature of Eros, the thing between the mortal world and the immortal world, between spirit and sensual, between God and human beings. We see the beautiful itself that Socrates just described in the person of Socrates, right? The way Alcibiades sees him. We catch a glimpse of the beautiful, as he suggests. And we see the lover, we see the person seeking after the beautiful in Alcibiades. Socrates just described Eros as a spirit of philosophy, and then here, the object of Alcibiades' love is Socrates, the quintessential philosopher. And so that's it. Most of our questions are now answered. We have the answers as to what the power of love is. We have a demonstration in the figure of Socrates. And we have, here in the modern age, we have Nietzsche's interpretation of the entire dialogue. And as for the lasting influence of this work on Nietzsche's ideas, I've touched on it briefly throughout, but it seems to me that we see a lasting influence in the idea of Eros as a force that acts on all life, but which is sublimated in various ways, and that how that relates to will to power. We could also see, maybe in the idea that to love life is to seek the eternity of life, and how that relates to the amor fati idea and the great challenge of eternal return. I might even go so far to say that if indeed Diotima of Mantinea is a real person, whose words we have through Socrates, we might well conclude she's probably the single most influential woman on the thought of Nietzsche, because her description of a mediating force driving all life, which is not self-preservative but aimed at self-overcoming, and ultimately wishing at the bottom of it all for eternity, seems to me to be an articulation in rough terms for many of the same things Nietzsche would write about will to power and about becoming, trying to transform itself into being. Because remember, from the note we went over in part 1 of our episodes on eternal return, the most sublime form of will to power is to transform becoming into being, to try and pull a phenomenon from the endless transformative flux, from the chaos of existence, and give it duration. It's the impossible dream. That's our deepest hope. The beautiful illusion that our will to power is always aiming at. And we have the same idea right here in the Symposium, thousands of years before Nietzsche was born. But perhaps this is not where we should linger for our final thought, because as we know, Socrates would take on a more central importance for Nietzsche as a figure he would often criticize or attack once he got a hold of what he called the problem of science, right? So we have to remember, though, that Socrates at this point in his career, he's still a figure of admiration for Nietzsche. And then there was, in fact, always an element of admiration in Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates, because Nietzsche recognized that he himself occupied a similar philosophical archetype, even when he recognized the problems inherent with this type. I've quoted this before, but one repays a teacher badly if he remains a student only. And so Nietzsche, of course, has to break with Socrates and turn his power of critique against him eventually. And so we should understand these attacks as Nietzsche overcoming his own mentor. But it's in the Symposium, as I said in the first episode, that we see what it is that Nietzsche originally saw in Socrates. And I don't think you can truly comprehend all those criticisms that Nietzsche makes of Socrates until you glimpse the same beautiful aspect of Socrates that Nietzsche did. And we have to see why it is that Nietzsche found Socrates so lovable. And in my opinion, Socrates is lovable right up until the end of the story. And so here's how the story ends. At the end, Socrates, he shows himself to possess that endurance and discipline of character that Alcibiades praised him for. After Alcibiades gives his drunken speech, all the participants start falling one by one into drunkenness and sleep. And a few others, stay up throughout the night talking and arguing. Even the narrator, the second-hand narrator, right, who told Apollodorus the story, Aristodemus, the guy who was actually there, even he begins to nod off. And so we'll close with this final paragraph, recounting the end of the Symposium. Quote, Aristodemus said that Eryximachus, Phaedrus, and the others went away. He himself fell asleep, and as the nights were long, took a good rest. He was awakened towards daybreak by a crowing of cocks, and when he awoke, the others were either asleep or had gone away. There remained only Socrates, Aristophanes, and Agathon, who were drinking out of a large goblet which they passed round, and Socrates was discoursing to them. Aristodemus was only half awake, and he did not hear the beginning of the discourse. The chief thing which he remembered was Socrates compelling the other two to acknowledge that the genius of comedy was the same with that of tragedy, and that the true artist in tragedy was an artist in comedy also. To this they were constrained to assent, being drowsy, and not quite following the argument. And first of all, Aristophanes dropped off. Then, when the day was already dawning, Agathon. Socrates, having laid them to sleep, rose to depart. Aristodemus, as was his manner, followed him. At the Lyceum, Socrates took a bath and passed the day as usual. In the evening, he retired and rested at his own home. End quote. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.